Every great game holds its secrets quietly, tucked behind the things we see clearly and the things we simply take for granted. The Pokemon franchise, spanning nearly 3 decades and hundreds of creatures, carries within it a remarkable density of hidden detail, design choices made in silence, and mechanical truths that most players will never encounter on their own. These are the facts that rest just beneath the surface of every playthrough, waiting for someone to look closely enough. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from learning something you never thought to question. A number you assumed was arbitrary that turns out to be a deliberate signal. A name you always pronounced without knowing what it actually meant. A creature you fought 100 times without ever noticing the detail that was sitting right there, visible in every encounter, every sprite, every line of Pokédex text. These are the facts that feel less like trivia and more like small gifts. Rewards for paying closer attention to something you already loved. Some of these discoveries change nothing about the way you play. Others reframe everything, making a moment from years ago suddenly click into place with new meaning. Whether they arrive as surprises or as quiet confirmations of something you once half noticed and then forgot, they share a common quality. They make the world feel richer, more deliberate, more carefully constructed than you might have believed. And in a series as vast as Pokémon, that sense of depth is one of the most enduring things it has ever offered. There is a Pokémon called Spinda, and most players who encountered it in the tall grass of the Hone region probably noticed that something about it felt slightly unusual in a way that was hard to name. Spinda is a bear-like creature with circular spots scattered across its body, and those spots vary between individual Pokémon in a way that is visible if you look at them side by side. Most players who knew about this variation might have assumed the differences were limited. A small pool of patterns rotated between encounters. The truth is considerably more extraordinary than that. The spots on a Spinda's body are not drawn from a small selection of preset patterns. They are generated procedurally based on the Pokémon's personality value, a number that is assigned to each individual Pokémon when it is first encountered or hatched. This personality value is a 32-bit number, which means there are over 4 billion possible values it can take. Each different personality value produces a different arrangement of spots on Spinda's body, and because each combination is effectively unique, the odds of finding two Spinda that share the exact same spot pattern are exactly 1 in 4,300,000,000. This is a number so large that it has no practical meaning in terms of the game itself. You could spend every waking hour for the rest of your life encountering Spinda in the wild, and you would almost certainly never find two that matched. The developers at Game Freak built a system of near infinite visual variety into a single creature that most players dismissed as unremarkable, and they did it so quietly that the depth of what they had built passed almost entirely unnoticed. Spinda holds within its spotted coat more distinct appearances than there are people on Earth, and most of the time. It loses to your Zigzagoon in 1 or 2 hits. What makes this detail so interesting is not just the number itself, but the intent behind it. Someone at Game Freak made a deliberate decision to encode that kind of variety into Spinda's design, knowing that the vast majority of players would never understand the scale of what they were looking at. The spots appear to shift slightly from one Spinda to the next, and that slight visual difference is all that most players ever register. The system beneath it, the mathematical architecture that ensures each one is essentially one of a kind, sits invisible and patient in the background of every single encounter. The quiet lesson in Spinda's design is that the Pokémon games have always been built with more depth than they require. Players don't need to know that each Spinda is statistically unique in order to catch one and move on. The game functions perfectly without that knowledge, but someone built the system anyway, embedded it into the code, and let it exist in silence. The kind of care for details that most people will never notice is one of the things that has kept this franchise feeling alive across so many years and so many generations of players. There are moves in the Pokemon series that hold very specific mechanical distinctions, quiet records, and unique properties that only reveal themselves when you start asking careful questions about the rules the game follows. Fire Fang is one such move. On the surface, it is a fairly straightforward physical fire type attack, the kind of move that shows up on the movesets of various predatory Pokemon and functions reliably in mid game battles. It has a decent base power, a reasonable accuracy, and a chance to inflict the burn status condition. Most players who use it never think much about it beyond those basics. But Fire Fang holds a distinction that sets it apart from every other fire type attack in the entire franchise. It is the only fire type move that has a chance to cause the target to flinch. Flinching is a status effect that prevents the affected Pokemon from moving during that turn, and it is associated most commonly with physical biting and striking moves. Many moves that involve direct physical contact have a flinch chance built into their secondary effects. Fire Fang is the singular exception within the fire type, carrying that flinch chance alongside its burn chance in a way that no other fire type move replicates. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem when you consider how fire type moves tend to function mechanically. Most of them are special attacks launched at range, blasts of flame and heat that connect with the target from a distance. Flinching, by contrast, is a phenomenon most naturally associated with the physical shock of a direct strike, the kind of impact that makes a creature recoil in the moment it is hit. Fire Fang bridges that gap by being both literally a physical bite and a fire type move simultaneously, and the flinch chance it carries is a consequence of that dual nature. It is a small thing, but it exists nowhere else in the fire type category. What makes details like this worth sitting with is the way they reveal the logic embedded in the game's design. Every type has its own identity, its own set of tendencies and expected behaviors. Fire types are expected to deal strong special damage, to inflict burns, to be effective against grass and ice and steel. They are not particularly associated with the disorienting physical impact of a flinch. Fire Fang stands alone as the exception to that tendency, and that exception exists because of where it sits at the intersection of two different design spaces. It bites, it burns, and because it bites, it can also make the target stagger. There is a gym leader in the Johto region named Bugsy who runs the Azalea Town Gym and specializes in bug-type Pokémon. He is the second gym leader players encounter in Gold and Silver, and he is most commonly remembered for his Scyther and his tendency to use Fury Cutter, a move that grows stronger the more times it connects in a row. Most players who defeated Bugsy accepted the TM he rewarded them with, stored it in their bag, and moved on without looking too carefully at the moment of the exchange. When Bugsy hands you Technical Machine 49 in the second generation games, he says something that functions as a small piece of embedded lore. He states that he discovered the bug-type attack, Fury Cutter, himself. This claim is remarkable for a few reasons. The first being that it is one of the very few instances in the mainline games where a character asserts that they personally created or discovered a specific battle move. Move origins are almost never addressed in the games. They exist as tools in the mechanical layer of the experience, categorized and numbered, and their origins are simply never discussed. Bugsy's claim also adds an unexpected dimension to what is otherwise a fairly straightforward gym leader encounter. He is presented as a studious and serious researcher of bug-type Pokémon, someone who approaches his specialty with genuine academic rigor rather than casual interest. Framing him as the discoverer of Fury Cutter connects his character identity to the in-world knowledge systems of the game in a way that makes the world feel more inhabited. Somewhere in Azalea Town, a young researcher studied bug Pokémon closely enough to identify and formalize a combat technique that no one had previously cataloged, and then he built his gym around teaching it. This is the kind of background detail that most players process without registering. You hear Bugsy's words, you take the TM, and you walk out into the next route, but the information sits there, quietly enriching the texture of the world. The Pokemon games are full of these small moments of embedded history, places where characters mention something in passing that implies a much larger story operating just off screen. Bugsy is one of the more specific and unusual examples. A gym leader who doesn't just battle you, but claims authorship over the very technique he used to do it. The familiar name that appears above the heads of the recurring antagonists in Team Rocket battles went through a surprisingly deliberate evolution across the first 3 generations of the franchise. Most players who grew up with these games encountered the name as a fixed and obvious feature of the enemy trainer type, but the final form of that label did not exist from the beginning. It arrived in stages, each one slightly more formal and complete than the last, as if the organization itself was gradually consolidating its identity. In the original Japanese red and green releases, as well as in the international red and blue versions, the trainer class was simply identified as Rocket. There was no accompanying title, no additional word to indicate the role these individuals played within the larger organization. They were members of Team Rocket, and the single word was sufficient to identify them. It was economical, and it gave the antagonist faction a certain blunt quality, as if the threat didn't need explanation or elaboration. When gold and silver arrived, the label expanded to Rocket Grunt. The addition of the word grunt added a layer of organizational hierarchy that the original name had implied, but never stated directly. A grunt is a low-level member of a larger structure, someone who follows orders and occupies the bottom tier of a chain of command. Calling these trainers grunts clarified their position within Team Rocket's internal structure and gave the faction a sense of scale that the original single-word label had left slightly ambiguous. The full and final official name, Team Rocket Grunt, did not appear until the 3rd generation. It was 3 entire games into the franchise before the antagonist organization's foot soldiers received their complete designation. This gradual formalization mirrors something real about how institutions accumulate their identity, adding vocabulary and structure over time as they grow and define themselves more clearly. The fact that it took 3 generations to settle on those 3 words is a small and strange piece of franchise history, the kind of thing that becomes visible only when you go back and look at the earlier games with the knowledge of what they would eventually become. The city of Eterna in the Sinnoh region contains a statue that has become one of the more quietly fascinating visual puzzles in the series. It stands prominently in the city, and players encounter it early in their journey through Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum without necessarily understanding what they are looking at. The statue appears to depict a large Pokémon, and depending on which version of the game you are playing, you might assume it represents the legendary creature associated with that version's central narrative. What the statue actually contains is both of the version-exclusive legendaries merged into a single form. The sculpture is designed as a visual puzzle that resolves differently depending on the angle from which you view it, blending the features of Dialga and Palkia into a single ambiguous shape. Dialga is the temporal dragon associated with the control of time, while Palkia commands space. Their physical designs are distinct, but share enough structural similarities to allow a skilled artist to combine them into something that reads convincingly as either one or both. The statue exists in the city before the narrative gives you full context for what it represents, which means players frequently move past it without fully understanding its significance. By the time the story has revealed the connection between Dialga, Palkia, and the events at Spear Pillar, many players have already forgotten the statue in Eterna City. But it was there from the beginning, holding both dragons in a single frame, suggesting the cosmological relationship between time and space that the game would eventually ask you to grapple with directly. In the remakes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, the statue received updated rendering that made the merged design somewhat more legible to players who already knew what they were looking at. For players encountering it fresh, it retains the quality of an optical illusion, a shape that shifts meaning depending on what knowledge you bring to the viewing. There is something fitting about placing such a sculpture in a game so preoccupied with the relationship between perception and reality between what is seen and what is understood. Heart scales are a recurring item in the Pokemon series, small and heart shaped and useful primarily for reminding Pokemon of moves they have forgotten. They appear in a number of locations across different games, and one of the most consistent sources for them has always been the Love Disc, a water type Pokemon shaped like a heart, whose very body seems to be the origin of the items it drops. Most players accept this as a straightforward design connection and move on, but in the Alola region, heart scales can also be found in Pony Canyon, an area located far from where Luvedisc typically appear. Finding them there initially seems like a standard item placement, scattered by the game across terrain where players explore. The Pokemon Jongmo-O, however, lives in Pony Canyon, and Jongmo-O has scales on its body in the shape of a heart. The scales on the dragon Pokemon's head are visually distinct and prominently displayed as part of its design. The implication carried by the item placements in Pony Canyon is that the heart scales found there are not Luvedisc scales at all. They are shed scales from Jongmo-O, left behind as the dragon Pokemon grew and changed, their heart shape persisting long after they detached from the creature that produced them. This adds a layer of ecological storytelling to a mechanic that most players use purely for its utility, connecting an item to a specific Pokemon and a specific place in a way that rewards careful attention to both the game's geography and its Pokédex entries. The detail also reveals something about how the game's designers thought about items within the context of the world. Heart scales are not simply abstract collectibles dropped by Pokemon for the player's convenience. They are physical objects that exist within the ecology of the game's world, produced by specific creatures in specific places, with origins that can be traced if you know where to look and which connections to draw. Most players never look, but the connection is there, quietly waiting in the canyon. There is something mildly counterintuitive about the way the move Fly functions in relation to the Bug and Flying dual type. Fly is one of the most iconic and widely used field moves in the series, a fundamental navigation tool that has been part of the franchise since the beginning. It carries an obvious thematic connection to the flying type, and most players assume that any Pokemon with flying as one of its types would have access to it without much difficulty. Bug and flying type Pokemon like Butterfree are the exception. Despite carrying the flying type as part of their identity, despite being airborne creatures whose entire existence is defined by their ability to take to the sky, they are categorically unable to learn the move Fly. This restriction applies broadly across the Bug and flying dual type and has persisted across multiple generations without being addressed as a gameplay oversight or corrected as an inconsistency. The reason for this restriction is partly practical and partly rooted in the design logic of what Fly represents within the game's world. Fly, as a travel move, implies a certain scale of transportation, the ability to carry a trainer across long distances between cities and towns. A butterfly or a moth, however capable in flight, does not naturally suggest the kind of large-scale transport that Fly implies. The move is most associated with large birds and dragon-type flyers, creatures whose size and strength make them plausible carriers. Butterfree, however graceful, does not fit that image. What makes the restriction interesting rather than simply frustrating is precisely that tension between the typing and the move. You would expect a Pokemon with flying as one of its types to have a natural claim on a move called Fly. The fact that it doesn't forces you to reconsider what flying as a type actually represents in this context, and what the designers were saying about the difference between the capacity for flight and the power of true aerial transport. It is a small mechanical fact with larger design implications, the kind of detail that reveals how carefully the rules of this world were constructed. Lieutenant Surge is the gym leader of the Vermilion City Gym in the Kanto region, and in most versions of the games, he fields a small team of electric-type Pokemon and presents a challenge that scales appropriately with the player's progression through the early game. He is remembered by many players for his personality as much as his battles. A loud and confident veteran who built his gym like a military installation and talks about battle with the casual authority of someone who has survived things most trainers haven't. In Pokemon Yellow, however, Lieutenant Surge's battle takes a different shape. He enters the fight with only a single Pokemon, his Raichu. This makes him one of the few gym leaders in the entire franchise to use only one Pokemon in their battle against the player, and it stands as an outlier in a series that generally gives gym leaders multiple Pokemon to create at least a moderate challenge. Yellow was designed as a closer adaptation of the anime, and in that context, Surge's single powerful Raichu feels more appropriate. A focused presentation of his identity as a trainer who builds around a single trusted partner. The significance of this detail is partly about scarcity and partly about what it says regarding the design philosophy of Yellow compared to the games that came before and after it. Red and Blue gave Surge a small team, Yellow gave him one. Later remakes and revisits would expand his roster again. But that singular Raichu battle in Yellow captures something specific about how Yellow tried to reframe the familiar Kanto story through the lens of the anime, stripping certain encounters down to their most essential dramatic form. There is also a subtle thematic consistency in having Surge face you with a single Pokemon in a game that places a single Pikachu at the center of the story. Your Pikachu walks beside you without being placed in a ball. Surge's Raichu battles you alone without the support of teammates. The structural parallel is quiet but present, a resonance between the two battles that feels intentional whether or not it was explicitly planned. Cherrim is a grass-type Pokemon that changes form during battle when the move Sunny Day is in effect, or when the sunlight is strong, shifting from a closed bud shape into a blooming flower with outstretched petals. The transformation is triggered by specific weather conditions, and it represents one of the more visually dynamic transformations available to a non-legendary Pokemon. Players who used Cherrim in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum likely encountered both of its forms during normal gameplay. What those players may not have noticed is that Cherrim's Sunshine form, the blooming version that activates in strong sunlight, is the only alternate form in the entire franchise that cannot be viewed in the Pokédex. Every other Pokemon with multiple forms allows players to see those forms reflected in their Pokédex entry, providing context and information about the alternate appearance. Cherrim's Sunshine form exists in battle, but disappears from the Pokédex entirely, leaving only the Overcast form visible in official documentation. This oversight, if it is an oversight, creates a quietly strange situation where one of Cherrim's two primary expressions is essentially undocumented in the game's own internal reference system. Players who battled against Cherrim or used it on their team would see the Sunshine form repeatedly, but checking the Pokédex afterward would give no indication that the form existed. The game knew about it. The battle system knew about it. The Pokédex simply didn't acknowledge it. Whether this was an intentional design choice or a technical limitation of the Generation 3 and 4 era, the result is the same. Cherrim's most vibrant and visually interesting form exists as a kind of ghost in the game's official record, present in experience and absent in documentation. For a Pokemon built around the idea of transformation, the absence of one of its transformations from the official record feels like a small and particular irony. Among the starter Pokemon introduced across all 9 generations of the mainline series, there is a considerable variety in physical forms and sizes. Some starters are small and light, designed to project agility and approachability. Others grow into imposing final forms that signal power and endurance. The variation across the full roster of final stage starters spans a wide range of physical scales, and most players who chose their starters never thought much about the specific numbers attached to those physical dimensions. Skeleturg, the fire and ghost type final evolution of the Fuecoco line, introduced in the 9th generation, holds a specific record within this group. It is by far the heaviest starter Pokemon in the entire franchise. Its listed weight in the Pokédex is 326.5 kilograms, which converts to 719.8 pounds. To put that number in context, Skeledirge outweighs every other starter final form by a significant margin, and it does so while being based on a crocodilian creature that is already associated with considerable bulk and physical mass. The record is not simply a matter of Skeledirge being slightly heavier than the competition. It genuinely belongs to a different weight category from most of its peers. The combination of its crocodilian inspiration, its armor like plating, and the ghostly energy concentrated in its body all contribute to a design that communicates mass and presence. The Pokédex weight reflects that design intention in a specific and measurable way, giving a number to the sense of solidity that the creature's visual design already communicates. Weight statistics in the Pokemon games are often treated as background flavor, numbers recorded in Pokédex entries that players glance at once and promptly forget. But records like this one carry a different quality. They mark the outer edge of something, the point at which the franchise reached its heaviest starter, and they anchor a visual impression in quantifiable terms. Skeledirge is heavy in every way the game can communicate, and the specific number it carries in its Pokédex entry is simply the measurement of something the design was already saying. The Pokemon Legends games introduced a deeper and more historical perspective on the world that players had been moving through for decades. Legends, Arceus in particular, gave players access to Hisui, an ancient version of the Sinnoh region, and the characters who lived there spoke about the Pokemon around them with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty appropriate to a time before the systematic study of Pokemon had fully developed. Within that context, certain facts about specific Pokemon were disclosed that had never been addressed in the mainline series. One of the most striking disclosures concerns the Hisuian form of Avalugg, an ice-type Pokemon that in its standard form resembles a flat-bodied glacier creature. The Hisuian version of Avalugg is considerably more imposing than its regional counterpart, a massive and heavy-set creature that carries echoes of an ancient world where Pokemon in the landscape were less clearly distinguished from each other. Within the lore of Legends, Arceus, a character named Volo, describes the potential scale that Hisuian Avalugg could reach. According to Volo, Hisuian Avalugg could grow up to 30 meters in length. This is a number that places it among the most physically substantial creatures discussed anywhere in the franchise, and it is particularly notable because 30 meters exceeds the size of many Pokemon that are canonically classified as Gigantamax forms. The Gigantamax mechanic was introduced in Sword and Shield as a way to represent Pokemon growing to enormous sizes beyond their normal boundaries, yet Hisuian Avalugg's potential natural scale apparently surpasses even that. The detail exists within the lore of the ancient Hisui region, where Pokemon were understood to be more powerful and less bounded than the Pokemon of the modern era. It speaks to a version of the world where the boundary between creature and environment was porous, where something that today registers as a medium-sized ice type could, in the right conditions and the right era, grow into something that would dwarf a building. This kind of historical depth is one of the most interesting things the Legends games added to the franchise's understanding of its own world. The legendary Pokemon, known as the Giants, stand apart from most of the legendaries in the franchise by virtue of their extreme simplicity of design. Regirock, Regis, and Registeel are ancient, elemental beings that predate human civilization in the lore of the games, and they are represented as enormous constructs made entirely of their respective materials, rock and ice and steel, with no facial features beyond a series of dots arranged in patterns on their bodies. They were introduced alongside the fourth giant, Regigigas, the towering normal type that supposedly created the others by moving mountains and shaping ice. The five giants together form a complete set, and for years most players treated them as a symmetric group, five powerful Pokemon sharing a common origin and a common design philosophy. But the five giants are not as symmetric as they appear. Registeel holds a distinction that separates it from the other four members of the group. Every other giant legendary, including Regirock, Regis, Regieleki, Regidrago, and Regigigas, has at least one base stat that equals exactly 200. For most of them, this is the HP stat, or the attack stat, or another primary attribute. The number 200 appears consistently across the group as a kind of shared numerical signature, a design constant that links them together in a measurable way beneath their visual and thematic similarities. Registeel is the sole exception. Not one of Registeel's base stats reaches 200. Its highest base stat falls short of that number, leaving it as the one giant that does not share the numerical signature that defines the rest of the group. Whether this was an intentional design choice or an oversight in the original stat assignment is unclear, but the result is a statistical anomaly within a carefully constructed legendary group, a single member that is defined in part by the absence of something the others all possess. This kind of internal consistency, broken by a single exception, is one of the more interesting patterns to find in the Pokémon games, because it suggests the designers were working with deliberate structures that occasionally developed cracks. The giant legendaries feel designed to be a unit, and most of the details support that reading. Registeel's missing 200 is the quiet exception that makes the pattern visible, the detail that you only notice when you compare all 5 against each other with the specific question in mind. The name Nurse Joy is one of the most recognized and frequently heard names in all of Pokémon. Joy greets players in every Pokémon Center and every region, an endlessly cheerful and uniformly helpful presence whose name has been spoken aloud by the in-game characters countless times across the franchise's history. Players who grew up with these games absorbed the name naturally, without necessarily thinking about where it came from or what it meant. It registered as a character name, familiar and consistent, and that was sufficient. The English name Nurse Joy was chosen partly because the character's role is to heal and restore, and the word joy captures the warmth and positive energy she projects in every interaction. But the origin of the name, in the Japanese version, is different, and the meaning it carries in that context is more precise and more interesting. In Japanese, the character's name comes from the word joy, which does not mean joy in the emotional sense at all. Joy is the Japanese word for a female doctor. This distinction reframes the character slightly. In the original Japanese conception, Nurse Joy is not named for the feeling of happiness or the cheerful energy she radiates. She is named for her medical role, specifically the gender designation for a female physician. The English translation captured the warmth but lost the specificity, shifting the name from a professional identifier to an emotional one. The result is that players in different language versions of the games have been carrying slightly different understandings of the same character for decades, each version reflecting the priorities and translation choices of the team that localized it. This kind of naming divergence is not unusual in the franchise, but the Nurse Joy example is one of the more revealing ones, because it touches on the character's function and identity rather than just her surface label. She is a healer, yes, but in her original conception, she was specifically a doctor, carrying a title that reflected training and professional standing rather than simply a friendly disposition. The warmth remained in both versions, but the foundation beneath it was different. The Moss Deep City Gym in the Hone region is led by twin psychic-type specialists named Tate and Liza, and the battle they present to players is unusual in a way that becomes meaningful when you consider the full context of the franchise. Most gym leaders challenge players to a single battle featuring one trainer and their team of Pokémon, a format that has defined the gym experience since the beginning of the series. Tate and Liza depart from that format entirely, presenting the player with a double battle from the moment the challenge begins. This makes them the first gym leaders in the franchise history to challenge players to a double battle, a distinction that carries more weight when you consider that double battles themselves had only been introduced in the same generation. Tate and Liza were not just an unusual gym encounter. They were one of the earliest formal showcases of the double battle format in the mainline series, a pair of gym leaders designed specifically to demonstrate what two trainers working in coordination could accomplish against a single opponent. Their status as the only official gym leader duo in the entire franchise adds to that distinction. Every other gym in every other generation is led by a single individual, one person with one team. Tate and Liza share their leadership, their identities, and their battle format in a way that no other gym leaders have replicated in any generation that followed. They remain the singular example of this configuration in the entire history of the games, a design choice that was made once and never repeated. The design choice itself reflects something specific about their character identities. As twins, Tate and Liza share an unusually close mental and emotional connection, a bond that the game frames as extending into their battle style. They think alike, they move together, and the double battle format expresses that connection mechanically. You are not fighting two individuals who happen to be in the same room. You are fighting a single unified will expressed through two bodies, and the format of the battle makes you feel that difference. The connection between Ditto and Mewtwo is one of the more quietly strange pieces of internal geography that the franchise maintains across multiple games. Mewtwo is the most powerful Pokémon available in the first generation, a legendary creature encountered at the end of a long and difficult dungeon, surrounded by a sense of isolation and immense power that signals its status as the game's ultimate challenge. Finding Mewtwo in Cerulean Cave is designed to feel like a significant and rare event, the culmination of the player's journey. But in the games up through Sun and Moon, everywhere that Mewtwo can be found, you will also find wild Ditto in the surrounding area. Cerulean Cave has Ditto in the same floors where Mewtwo waits. Other locations in later games where Mewtwo appears maintain the same pattern, with Ditto consistently present in close proximity. The pairing is not accidental. It reflects something about the shared lore that surrounds both Pokémon. Mewtwo was created in a laboratory through genetic manipulation of Mew's Na, an origin story that the games hint at through in-game text and notes found in the locations where Mewtwo's backstory is disclosed. Ditto, in the lore that surrounds it, is widely theorized to be a failed result of the same experiments, a creature that retained only the ability to transform and replicate rather than developing into the precise and powerful form the scientists intended. The presence of Ditto near Mewtwo across multiple games is not simply a convenient spawn placement, it is a spatial expression of a shared origin story. Whether the connection is officially confirmed or remains at the level of strongly implied canon, the effect is the same. The geography of each game reinforces the backstory that the Pokédex entries and in-game documents suggest, layering meaning into the simple act of encountering two different species in the same location. Players who spent time in Cerulean Cave catching Ditto without thinking about why they were there were already inside the story of Mewtwo's creation, whether they recognized it or not. The Pokemon Rotom made its debut in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum as a small electric and ghost type that could possess household appliances and take on different forms based on which appliance it entered. It was an unusual Pokemon with a distinctive design and a ghost typing that gave it a specific atmospheric quality different from most of the electric types in the region. Players who encountered it in the old chateau late at night under specific conditions remembered it as one of the more unusual encounter experiences in the Sinnoh games. One of the most memorable things about encountering Rotom in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum was the music. When you entered the battle with Rotom, instead of the standard wild encounter theme that accompanied battles with ordinary wild Pokemon, the game played the legendary encounter theme, the music reserved for battles with legendary Pokemon of exceptional power and significance. The effect was striking enough that players noticed it immediately, and it contributed to the sense of Rotom being something more special and mysterious than a standard wild encounter. The reason for this music was not a deliberate design choice to elevate Rotom's status. It was a mistake, somewhere in the development of the game. Rotom's music file was swapped with the music file belonging to Cresselia, the lunar legendary Pokemon associated with the Full Moon Island event. Cresselia uses the standard wild encounter theme rather than the legendary one, which made the swap doubly unusual. A legendary using the ordinary music, while a non legendary used the legendary music. The two files simply exchanged between two very different Pokemon. The error was corrected in later versions of the games, and Rotom eventually received its own music as it grew in prominence across subsequent generations. But for players who experienced Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum in their original state, Rotom's legendary encounter music was a formative part of how the Pokemon registered in memory. The mistake gave Rotom a weight and presence in those early encounters that it technically hadn't earned yet, creating expectations that the later games spent years fulfilling. The cave in the Kalos region of Pokemon X and Y, where Zygarde rests, is called Terminus Cave, in the English localization of the games. The name suggests an ending, a final point, a place where something concludes. For a Pokemon associated with balance and the restoration of order in times of collapse, the location name carries appropriate thematic resonance in English. Players moved through it toward the encounter at the end, without necessarily wondering whether the name had been translated or whether something was lost in that translation. In other language versions of X and Y, the cave is named differently. It is called the Omega Cave. The shift from Terminus to Omega is more than just a translation choice. It engages a specific symbolic register that the English name handles more abstractly. Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, the final character in a system that begins with alpha. Z, the letter most associated with Zygarde, is the last letter of the Latin alphabet. The two systems mirror each other, the last letter of one ancient alphabet paired with the last letter of its modern counterpart. The name Omega Cave encodes Zygarde's symbolic position within the franchise's cosmology more precisely than Terminus Cave does. Zygarde is order, the final balance, the ultimate state that emerges when the other forces in the system have resolved. Naming its home after the last letter of the Greek alphabet, and a game whose title also uses a letter from the end of the sequence, builds a layered symbolic structure that the English localization softened into a more straightforward directional metaphor. Both names work. Both communicate something true about the location and its occupant. But the Omega Cave makes a connection that Terminus Cave doesn't, linking the geography of the game to the symbolic logic of the alphabet systems it draws from. The layers are quiet, the kind of thing you only notice when you hold both names side by side and think about what each one is actually saying. The move Memento has existed in the Pokémon series since the third generation, and its mechanical function is unlike most moves in the game. Using Memento causes the Pokémon that uses it to faint immediately. In exchange for that sacrifice, the opposing Pokémon has both its attack and special attack sharply reduced, giving the trainer a strategic advantage at the cost of losing the Pokémon that executed the move. It is a self-sacrificial move, a last resort with a dramatic mechanical and thematic weight. The name Memento carries meaning beyond what most players registered when they first encountered it in the move list. In Latin, the phrase memento mori translates to remember that you must die. It is a classical expression of mortality, a reminder of the universal fact of death used in philosophical traditions as a prompt toward living fully and with intention. The phrase appears across art and literature and religious practice as a meditation on impermanence and the value of what time we have. The move that kills the user in order to weaken the enemy, named after a Latin phrase that means remember, you must die, is one of the most precisely named moves in the entire franchise. The sacrifice embedded in the mechanic is directly encoded in the name, the Latin root, connecting the act of fainting on purpose to the long human tradition of contemplating mortality as a meaningful fact rather than simply a negative outcome. It is a very small philological detail with a considerably larger philosophical weight behind it. Most players who used Memento in competitive battles thought of it purely in terms of its strategic function. Bring in a Pokémon, use Memento, bring in your sweeper against a weakened opponent. The name registered as flavor, a word attached to a mechanic, but the word was chosen deliberately, and the deliberateness is worth noticing, a reminder that even the move names in these games occasionally carry the weight of careful thought. The Enigma Berry is one of several berries in the Pokemon games whose primary mechanical function is tied to specific battle conditions, activating to restore HP when the holder is hit with a super effective attack. Like many berries, it is used primarily by experienced players who build teams with precise item assignments and battle strategies in mind. For most casual players, it appeared in the berry list, got filed away, and was never examined closely. What casual players missed is that the Enigma berry has a visual detail embedded in its artwork that comments directly on its own nature. If you look at the artwork for the Enigma berry with care, you can see a question mark drawn inside the berry itself, visible as a design element on the fruit's surface. The question mark is the symbol of the unknown, the mark of something unexplained, and placing it inside the Enigma berry is exactly the kind of self-referential visual joke that rewards players who actually look at the items they are carrying. The name Enigma means mystery, something that resists explanation or understanding. Naming a berry Enigma and then putting a question mark on it is a very direct way of acknowledging its own ambiguity. It is as if the designers wanted the item to wear its own inscrutability as a badge, to announce through its visual design that it is aware of being a puzzle. For an item tucked away in a berry pouch that most players never open, that is a considerable amount of design intention invested in a single piece of fruit. Details like the question mark on the Enigma berry are the kind of thing that gets discovered years after the games are released, when someone finally zooms into the item art far enough to see what has always been there. They are evidence of a design culture that extends its care into places that most players will never look, building depth and humor and reference into every layer of the experience, regardless of whether anyone will ever notice. The trainer classes in the Gold and Silver games follow specific behavioral patterns when deciding which moves to use during battle. The artificial intelligence that governs trainer behavior was significantly improved in the second generation compared to the first, and most trainer classes were programmed to select moves according to reasonable strategic logic, prioritizing effective attacks over ineffective ones, and making decisions that resembled the choices a thoughtful player might make. This created battles that felt more intentional and challenging than the somewhat random move selection that had characterized some first-generation encounters. Every trainer class in Gold and Silver follows this logical AI pattern. Every class except one. The Twins trainer class, representing young sisters who battle together, is programmed to select moves entirely at random, following the same behavior pattern used by wild Pokémon when a pair of twins decides which move to use on their turn. The game does not consult the strategic logic that governs every other trainer class in the game. It simply rolls the outcome, selecting from the available moves without preference or priority. The decision to give the twins class random AI is interesting rather than merely strange because of what it implies about the character design intention behind the class. The twins are young trainers, presumably inexperienced, the kind of players who would be expected to make unpredictable and sometimes counterproductive battle choices. Giving them random move selection is a way of encoding their inexperience into the game's mechanics, letting their youth and improvisation manifest as genuine unpredictability in battle rather than simulated unpredictability through strategic randomness. Whether players ever noticed that battles against the Twins class felt genuinely different from battles against other trainers is uncertain. The randomness of wild Pokemon battle AI is something players learn to anticipate without explicitly identifying. Encountering that same randomness in trainer battles might have registered as unusual without the reason for it being apparent. The Twins battled like wild Pokemon because someone decided that was appropriate for who they were. And that decision lived quietly in the game's code for years before anyone analyzed it closely enough to notice. Translation work on the Pokemon games across different languages has produced some unexpected divergences in how the same Pokemon are named and identified between regions. Most of these differences are minor. Adjustments made for phonetic consistency or cultural appropriateness in different language contexts. Some, however, create genuine oddities that reveal how naming conventions interacted with each other across the generation gaps. In South Korea, the Pokemon known as Beldum and most language versions of the games carries a different name entirely. Korean players know Beldum as Metong, which is the name that other language versions use for Beldum's evolution. The evolution of Beldum, which is Metong in English and most other languages, receives a different name in Korean to avoid the repetition. This means that Korean players experience the Beldum line with a naming structure that shifts differently at each stage compared to the version that players in other regions encounter. The practical effect of this is subtle but persistent. Players discussing the Beldum line across language communities would use different names for the same Pokemon, and any cross reference between Korean game documentation and documentation from other regions would require an additional step of translation to clarify which creature was being discussed. It is the kind of naming issue that has no clean solution, because the original name in one language creates a conflict when applied to the same family in another language's existing framework. These cross-language naming discrepancies are a small but persistent feature of a franchise that has always operated across multiple language markets simultaneously, adapting names and references for each context while trying to maintain enough consistency that players around the world are recognizably talking about the same creatures. Most of the time, that process works smoothly. The Beldum Matang situation is one of the moments where it created a quiet knot that has simply been lived with rather than resolved. Golurk is a ghost and ground type Pokemon introduced in the 5th generation, a massive automaton that resembles an ancient clay golem and carries in its Pokédex lore the suggestion of an artificially created entity whose power source is a mysterious ancient energy. Its design evokes the clay figures of ancient traditions, creatures given life through the investment of spiritual power and carrying a weight and solemnity appropriate to something old and constructed rather than born. As a battler, it is used primarily for its physical attack stat and its unusual typing. What surprises many players is that Golurk can learn the move Fly, despite having no wings and no immediately obvious mechanism for aerial travel. A creature that resembles a stone statue or a heavy clay construct with no external features that suggest flight capability, nonetheless appears in the move list for Fly and can be taught the HM that enables it. The contradiction between visual design and move availability is notable enough that it has prompted questions from players who notice the inconsistency. The explanation for Golurk's ability to use Fly comes not from the games themselves, but from the anime, specifically from a movie where Golurk demonstrates flight by opening a panel on its torso and igniting rocket boosters within its body. The image of a massive clay golem firing rocket engines from inside its chest and taking flight is one of the more surreal moments in Pokemon media, but it provides the mechanical justification for an otherwise inexplicable entry in the move list. Golurk flies the way a rocket flies, not the way a bird flies. The connection between the anime demonstration and the game's move availability is a small example of how the different arms of the franchise inform each other across media. The anime establishes something visual and memorable. The games then incorporate that established fact into their mechanical rules. Most players encounter the move availability and wonder briefly about the logic. A smaller number discover the anime's explanation and find that the logic, once understood, is actually quite consistent, if unusual. The Pokédex entry for Torterra in Pokémon Platinum is one of the more evocative pieces of in-world lore that the 4th generation games contain. Torterra is the final evolution of the Turtwig line, a grass and ground type that resembles a large tortoise with a tree and rocky landscape growing on its shell. Its design draws from the ancient mythological concept of a world turtle, a creature large enough to carry an entire landscape on its back and whose movement corresponds to geological events in the world above. Platinum's entry takes this design concept and extends it into biological fact within the game's world. It states plainly that small Pokemon are born on Torterra's back and spend their entire lives living there. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. The entry presents it as a documented fact about Torterra's ecology, something that actually happens in the world that players move through. The landscape on Torterra's back is not decorative, it is habitat, a functioning environment that supports the life cycles of other creatures. The implication is that players who encountered wild Torterra in the 4th generation games were looking at creatures that might have been carrying other Pokemon on their backs. Entire populations of small creatures born and living and dying on a platform that walked through the world without any of the creatures it supported fully understanding what it was standing on. The Pokemon games have always used Pokédex entries to suggest a world that extends far beyond what the player can directly observe, and this Torterra entry is one of the more vivid expressions of that depth. It connects Torterra to a tradition of mythological thinking about scale and perspective that stretches back thousands of years in human cultures. The world turtle, the world supported on the back of something vast and slow and ancient, is a recurring image in the mythologies of multiple unconnected traditions. Torterra's Pokédex entry locates that mythological figure within the specific ecological rules of the Pokemon world, giving the ancient image a scientific framing that makes it feel both familiar and freshly imagined. The move Focus Energy in the 1st generation of Pokemon games was intended to increase the user's critical hit ratio, boosting the chance that their attacks would land with increased force on the opponent. The concept was straightforward, a move that primed the using Pokemon for a more powerful strike, reflecting a preparation or concentration mechanic that had analogs in fighting games and role-playing games of the era. Players who used it expected to see more critical hits in the turns that followed. What actually happened was the opposite. Due to a coding error in the 1st generation games, using Focus Energy did not increase the critical hit ratio. It divided the critical hit ratio by 4. Players who used Focus Energy were actively reducing their chance of landing critical hits, making themselves statistically worse at the thing the move was explicitly designed to help them do. The error was not subtle or ambiguous. It directly inverted the intended effect, turning a beneficial move into a self-sabotaging one. The bug persisted through the entire 1st generation without being caught or corrected. Players who used Focus Energy in red and blue and yellow were operating under a consistent misunderstanding of what the move did. Trusting the name and description to accurately reflect the mechanical reality, unaware that the code behind the description had gotten the direction of the effect exactly backward. For the entire run of those games, Focus Energy was a move that made players worse at the game every time they used it. The correction came in later generations when the move's code was fixed to function as described. But for the entire 1st generation experience, Focus Energy was a quiet trap, sitting in the move list with a name that promised improvement and delivering the opposite. Players who never analyzed their battle logs closely enough to notice the discrepancy used it in good faith for years. Those who did eventually notice might have assumed their luck was simply bad. The truth was more specific than that, and considerably more ironic. Pony Island is the 4th and final island of the Alola region, the most remote and least populated of the 4 islands that make up the setting of Sun and Moon. It is associated with a sense of ancient wildness that distinguishes it from the more developed islands earlier in the game, a place where the landscape feels older and less shaped by human or Pokemon habitation than the routes and cities players encountered earlier in their journey. The feeling of Pony Island is one of reaching the edge of the known world, moving beyond the structured paths of the earlier game into something less mapped. One of the specific ways this wildness is expressed in the game's design is the complete absence of numbered routes on Pony Island. Every other island in the Alola region has numbered routes, the standard organizational structure that the Pokemon games have used since the beginning to divide the overworld into named and cataloged sections. The routes on the other islands connect towns and landmarks through numbered paths that impose a familiar order on the landscape. Pony Island has none of this. Its areas are named for their natural features or their cultural significance, not numbered according to a central organizational scheme. This makes Pony Island the only island in the Alola region, and one of the very few areas in the entire franchise to exist outside the numbered route system that has organized Pokemon geography since the beginning. The design choice is appropriate to the character of the island and the stage of the journey it represents. By the time players reach Pony Island, the numbered routes have been a constant feature of the experience for dozens of hours. Arriving somewhere that uses a different organizational logic that presents its landscape without the reassuring structure of numbered paths signals a transition into something less familiar and more genuinely unexplored. The absence of numbers is itself a kind of statement about where you are. The Dark type was added to the Pokémon franchise in the second generation, introduced alongside the Steel type as part of a deliberate effort to rebalance the game's type matchup system. Dark-type Pokémon appeared throughout the Johto region and were featured prominently in the designs of several important antagonist-affiliated Pokémon, connecting the type visually and narratively with themes of difficulty, stealth, and moral ambiguity. The type became an established part of the franchise's design vocabulary almost immediately. Despite that early establishment, the franchise went a remarkable length of time before introducing a gym leader who specialized in the Dark type. The Dark type was introduced in 1999 in the Japanese release of Gold and Silver. A gym leader who used Dark type Pokemon as their primary specialty did not appear in the mainline series until Pokemon Sword and Shield, released in 2019. That is exactly 20 years between the introduction of the type and the first specialist gym leader. The 20-year gap also spans 8 full generations of the mainline series. The Dark type was present in every one of those generations, used by trainers and villains and wild Pokemon throughout. It was represented in Elite Four lineups and occasionally carried by gym leaders in small numbers as secondary or tertiary Pokemon. But no gym leader made it the foundation of their identity during all that time across all those games, until Piers in Sword and Shield finally claimed the type as his signature. Why the gap existed for so long is a question that doesn't have an official answer. The Dark type's association with stealth and moral ambiguity may have made it feel tonally inappropriate for the generally straightforward and heroic framing of the gym challenge structure. Or the gap may simply reflect the distribution of creative attention across the type roster. Whatever the reason, 20 years and 8 generations is a long time for a type to exist without its own gym, and the detail is one of the stranger anomalies in the franchise's long history. The Cherish Ball is one of the rarest items in the mainline Pokemon games, a specialized Pokeball that appears exclusively in Pokemon obtained through official event distributions. It is never placed in the player's bag through normal gameplay, cannot be purchased from any Pokemart in any version, and has no in-game method of legitimate acquisition beyond receiving an event Pokemon already holding one. Its rarity gives it a special status in the eyes of collectors and players who treat their event Pokemon as particularly precious. Given the Cherish Ball's exclusive status and the ceremonial weight it carries as the container for rare and specially distributed Pokemon, players might reasonably assume that it was designed with enhanced catching properties. The obvious design logic would suggest that a ball reserved for official events and treated as more precious than any standard catching tool would offer at least some mechanical advantage over the basic Pokeball. The name itself implies care and value. The appearance reinforces that impression. In fact, the Cherish Ball has a catch rate of 1 times. This is the same catch rate as the basic Pokeball, the most ordinary and widely available Pokeball in the game. If someone were to hack a Cherish Ball into their game and attempt to use it to catch a wild Pokemon in the field, it would perform no better than the ball available for 200 Pokedollars at the first Pokemart in the game. The ceremony of the cherished ball is entirely aesthetic. Its function is entirely ordinary. This detail carries a gentle irony that reflects something true about how prestige and function sometimes diverge. The rarest ball in the game catches Pokemon no better than the cheapest one. The ceremony exists independently of the mechanical reality. Players who received event Pokemon and Cherish Balls were receiving something genuinely special, not because of the ball's catching power, but because of what the ball represented about the provenance of the Pokemon inside it. The value was always in the story, not the stats. The mythical Pokemon Zarude exists in two forms, a standard form and the Dada form, which was distributed as part of a promotion tied to the movie Pokemon the Movie Secrets of the Jungle. Dada Zarude carries a cape in its design, a cloth wrapped around its body that distinguishes it visually from the standard form. For most players who received Dada Zarude through the event distribution, the cape registered as a visual distinction and nothing more, a detail that marked this version as different from the one they might encounter under other circumstances. The cape carried a number on it, specifically the number 251. Players who received Dada Zarude and examined it closely enough to notice the number, and then thought about where that number appeared in the franchise's internal reference system, would make the connection. 251 is the national Pokédex number of Celebi, the mythical time-traveling Pokemon from the second generation. Celebi is also central to the plot of the movie that the Dada Zarude promotion was tied to. The number on the cape is a direct reference to Celebi's Pokédex position, a piece of visual lore embedded in Dada Zarude's design that ties the two mythical Pokemon together within the context of their shared movie. It is the kind of detail that rewards players who catalog Pokédex numbers, who carry in memory the specific position of specific Pokemon within the franchise's internal numbering system. For those players, seeing 251 on the cape immediately activated the connection. For everyone else, it was simply a number on a cloth. These kinds of embedded references, where the design of one Pokemon quietly encodes a connection to another through a specific number or a specific visual detail, are scattered throughout the franchise. They reward engagement with the full breadth of the series and create layers of meaning that persist beneath the surface of normal gameplay. Dada Zarude's cape is one of the more precise examples, a single number doing the work of a complete narrative connection. Pokémon Legends Arceus introduced a new approach to the series that changed how players interacted with Pokémon in the overworld, and it also introduced a reworked version of the Evolution family that players could obtain through gameplay. The Eevee family has been one of the most beloved Pokémon groups since the second generation, and the ability to obtain various evolutions in different contexts is a feature that returning fans look for in each new game. In the Hisui region of Legends Arceus, many of the evolutions can be found in a specific location called Wild Zone 20. This area functions as a concentration point for Pokémon from the Eevee evolutionary family, and players hunting for specific evolutions will find that Wild Zone 20 provides access to nearly the entire roster of available forms. Almost every evolution can be encountered there, making it the most efficient single location for players who want to complete the Eevee family collection. However, two specific evolutions are conspicuously absent from the Wild Zone 20 spawn pool: Espeon and Umbreon, the psychic and dark type evolutions that were introduced in the second generation and are connected to the cycle of day and night, do not appear there. Every other form of Eevee's evolutionary tree is present, but Espeon and Umbreon are simply missing, absent from a location that includes their siblings in a pattern that draws attention precisely because it is otherwise so comprehensive. The absence of Espeon and Umbreon from that specific spawn pool is noted by players who investigate it, and while the practical consequence is simply that players need to find those two evolutions elsewhere, the pattern itself is curious. A list of nearly everything that excludes two specific members invites questions about why those two were excluded. Whether the answer is mechanical, thematic, or simply practical, the gap is there. quietly marking the space where the night and day pair should be among their family. Pokemon Yellow holds a peculiar record within the mainline series that most players would never think to check. The game's full official title is not simply Pokemon Yellow. The complete title, printed on packaging and in official materials, is Pokemon Yellow Special Pikachu Edition. When you count the characters in that full title, including spaces, you arrive at 30 characters exactly. This makes it the longest title of any core series mainline game in the franchise's history. For a game that is remembered primarily as the anime-inspired variation of the original Kanto adventure, a companion game rather than a groundbreaking new entry. Holding the franchise record for longest official title is an unexpected distinction. Red and Blue have short titles. Gold and Silver are equally brief. Every mainline title that followed Yellow used names of comparable brevity, 2 words, a color or a gem or a metallic sheen. None of them approached 30 characters. The length of Yellow's title was partly a product of its specific positioning as a special edition. The words Special Pikachu Edition were added to communicate something about the game's identity that the color alone couldn't convey, indicating that this was a particular kind of Yellow game rather than simply another entry in the generation. The practical consequence of all those added words was a title that grew to a length no other core series game has since matched. Whether this record has any significance beyond the curiosity of the number is questionable, but it is the kind of record that becomes interesting when you ask whether it will ever be broken. Whether any future core series game will ever carry a complete official title longer than 30 characters. Based on the naming conventions the franchise has followed since Yellow, the answer seems to be probably not. Yellow holds that record in a way that appears permanent, the longest name in a series that has consistently preferred brevity. Arbok is a poison-type Pokemon from the first generation, a Cobra-based creature whose most visually striking feature is the large patterned marking on its hood, the broad, flat skin that spreads at the back of its head when it is threatened or displaying. The pattern is prominent and distinctive, and players who encountered Arbok in Red and Blue or Yellow accepted it as a fixed visual element of the Pokemon's design. The hood marking was part of what Arbok looked like, as constant as the type or the cry. What those players may not have known is that the marking on Arbok's hood is not fixed across all Arbok. The pattern varies depending on which region the Arbok is from. This regional variation in Arbok's design is confirmed by multiple Pokédex entries across different games and also appears in the official manga adaptation of the Pokémon story. Different regions produce Arbok with different configurations of the pattern on their hoods, and the variation is meaningful within the world's ecology, not simply a cosmetic difference. The pattern on an Arbok's hood functions partly as threat display, the terrifying face-like marking designed to frighten predators and protect the snake. Different regional populations have developed different configurations of that marking, possibly in response to different predator communities or different environmental pressures that made certain patterns more effective as deterrents. The biological logic underlying the variation is consistent with how real-world animal coloration and patterning can differ across separated populations. For most players, Arbok was simply Arbok, one visual identity repeated in every encounter. The reality within the world is richer than that, a species with regional diversity visible in its most prominent feature, a detail confirmed in official documentation, and yet almost never encountered directly, because the games themselves generally present only one regional variant in each specific game's wild encounters. The variation exists in the world. Players just rarely see both sides of it. Pokerus is one of the most positively framed disease mechanics in the history of video games. Introduced in the second generation, it is a beneficial virus that Pokemon can contract in the wild or receive through contact with infected Pokemon. A Pokemon that has Pokerus doubles the effort value points it receives from battles, making it a significant training advantage sought by players who optimize their Pokemon's stats. Its name combines Pokemon and a suffix derived from the Latin word for disease, and the games treat it as a rare and fortunate discovery when a player's Pokemon becomes infected. Pokerus persisted as a feature of the franchise for generations, appearing in every mainline game from Gold and Silver forward and remaining a quietly sought advantage for competitive players building optimized teams. The mechanic required no particular engagement or explanation once players understood what it did. A Pokemon got Pokerus, the player spread it to the rest of the party, and the training process became more efficient. The virus was simply a useful thing to have. In Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, released in 2022, Pokerus was removed from the game entirely. It does not appear in either game as a learnable, contractable, or spreadable mechanic. The reasons for its removal were not officially discussed in detail, but the context in which the games were released made the thinking relatively obvious to most observers. Releasing a game mechanic centered on a contagious virus that spreads between Pokemon through contact at a point in the global timeline when experiences with contagious spreading illness were still very present in public consciousness presented a tone problem that the developers apparently chose to resolve by removing the mechanic rather than addressing it in context. Pokerus was never a harmful mechanic. It was always beneficial, always framed positively, always treated as a fortunate discovery. But the specific language and imagery of a contagious virus spreading through a community of creatures carried associations in the early 2020s that it hadn't carried in 1999, and those associations were apparently enough to make the inclusion feel uncomfortable. The decision reflects how the cultural context surrounding a game's release can affect design choices in ways that have nothing to do with the mechanic's own internal logic. The Master Ball is the ultimate Pokeball in the franchise, a device that catches any wild Pokemon without fail and requires no weakening of the target, no strategic setup, no multiple attempts. It is the guaranteed solution to any catching problem, the item a trainer holds back for the most difficult and important encounters. Its reputation as the ball that never fails is central to its identity and its value within the game's item economy. In most of the games where the Master Ball appears, its infallibility is mechanically absolute. You throw it, the target is caught, the encounter ends. The visual presentation is simple and efficient, the ball flying, the Pokemon disappearing, the capture registering without drama or uncertainty. This is appropriate to a device that has always been defined by its certainty. In Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, the Master Ball retains its ultimate catch rate, but the legendary Pokemon, who appear as catchable encounters in those games, received a special response to being thrown at. When you throw a Master Ball at Mewtwo, or at the legendary birds, Zapdos, Articuno, or Moltres, those Pokemon perform a unique animation in which they swat the ball away. The ball is deflected visibly by the legendary Pokemon before bouncing back and then successfully completing the catch. This moment is one of the more unexpected small details in the Let's Go games, a brief theatrical beat where the legendary acknowledges the incoming ball and rejects it before the ball captures them anyway. It is a visual expression of the tension between the Pokemon's power and the trainer's determination, a moment where the game acknowledges that Mewtwo is not simply standing passively waiting to be captured. The swat happens, the capture happens anyway. The Master Ball wins, as it always does, but the legendary gets one last moment of refusal before the ball completes its work. In 2002, a small piece of Pokemon history arrived on a console that most players had never heard of and many have forgotten. The Pokemon Mini was a miniature handheld gaming device released in several markets, smaller than the Game Boy Advance, and designed for a very specific style of casual, short-session gameplay. It had its own library of games, none of them particularly complex. All of them oriented toward simple mechanics that suited the small screen and limited inputs of the device. Among the games released for the Pokemon Mini was Pokemon Tetris, an official crossover between the Pokemon franchise and the classic puzzle game. Tetris, one of the most recognized video game titles in existence, had been ported and adapted for dozens of platforms by that point. And the Pokemon version brought Tetris gameplay into the franchise's aesthetic, a straightforward mechanical combination that made sense as a product, even if it left no particular mark on the franchise's broader history. The existence of an official Pokemon Tetris release is the kind of fact that falls into the category of franchise trivia that most players simply don't know. Because the Pokemon Mini was a minor commercial presence in most markets, and its library was never discussed with the same prominence as the mainline games or even the Game Boy spin offs. The game exists as a factual record, an officially licensed release that connects two of the most recognized gaming franchises in history, sitting quietly in the catalog alongside other Pokemon Mini titles that most players have also never encountered. For the dedicated historian of the franchise, Pokemon Tetris is a genuine entry in the official canon of Pokemon games, a product that existed and was sold and was played by someone somewhere in 2002. For everyone else, it is the kind of discovery that prompts a moment of genuine surprise, the realization that somewhere in the franchise's vast commercial history there is an official Pokemon Tetris that most people alive have simply never known about. Girafarig is a normal and psychic-type Pokemon introduced in the second generation, notable primarily for its distinctive two-headed appearance. The creature has a standard head at the front of its long neck and a smaller secondary head at the end of its tail, giving it an unusual bilateral quality that no other Pokemon from that era shared. Players who used Girafarig in Gold and Silver might have noted the two-head design as a quirk of its appearance without examining its name closely. Girafarig's name is a palindrome. Spelled forward, it reads Girafarig. Spelled backward, it reads exactly the same. The name was constructed deliberately to mirror its own design, a creature that reads the same from front to back, like a name that reads the same from right to left. This is one of the more elegant examples of character and name being aligned in the franchise, a design choice where the visual symmetry of the two-headed creature is reflected directly in the verbal symmetry of its name. The 8th generation introduced an evolution for Girafarig called Farigiraf, and this name carries its own wordplay. Farigiraf is not a palindrome, it is an anagram of Girafarig, using all the same letters in a different arrangement. The evolution of a palindrome is an anagram, a relationship between the two names that mirrors something about the relationship between the two Pokemon. Girafarig arranges its letters in perfect symmetry. Farigiraf takes those same letters and shuffles them into something new, just as the evolution process transforms the base creature into a different arrangement of the same essential material. The naming logic for this evolutionary line is one of the more inventive examples of linguistic design in the franchise, connecting two generations of games through a wordplay relationship that was either planned across the span of those years or constructed retroactively with enough cleverness to make it feel deliberate. Whether planned from the beginning or designed to reward fans of wordplay in the 8th generation, the palindrome and its anagram evolution form a complete and satisfying pair. Most mainline Pokemon games introduce new items to the series, alongside their new Pokemon and new regions. Items are a fundamental part of the game's mechanical vocabulary, and new generations typically expand the item vocabulary significantly, adding held items, consumables, key items, and other tools that reflect the new mechanics and context of each generation's specific features. Players who collect comprehensively and track the item catalog notice when a new entry appears, and the introduction of new items is generally expected as a normal part of each new generation. There are exactly 2 exceptions in the entire franchise's history to the pattern of each mainline game introducing new items. The first exception is the original Japanese Pokémon Blue, which was a rebalanced version of the first generation games adjusted for mass release after the initial limited print run of Red and Green. Japanese Blue introduced no new items, using the same item catalog as the games that preceded it. The second exception is Pokémon Yellow, the special Pikachu edition that followed and adapted the Kanto adventure into something closer to the anime. Both of these exceptions are from the first generation, and both are connected to games that were positioned as variations or enhancements of existing releases rather than entirely new entries in the series. Japanese Blue was a correction and expansion of the original game. Yellow was an adaptation of the existing story into a new frame. Neither was designed as a full new generation, and the absence of new items in both cases reflects their status as refinements rather than extensions of the franchise's world. The coincidence that both itemless entries come from the same generation is not entirely surprising given the context, but it creates a specific record that has not been replicated since. Every generation that introduced genuinely new games, from Gold and Silver onward, brought new items alongside everything else. The two exceptions remain isolated in the first generation, artifacts of a period when the franchise was still establishing its own expectations for what a new entry was required to provide. Castelia City in the Unova region is one of the more visually impressive urban environments in the franchise, a dense metropolitan setting modeled loosely on a major city with tall buildings, a busy harbor, and a sense of urban scale that distinguishes it from the smaller towns and cities typical of earlier Pokemon games. Players exploring Castelia City find shops and services and side activities distributed across the city's streets, and most treat the tall buildings as backdrop to those activities rather than destinations in themselves. One specific building in Castelia City is notable for what it contains. The building serves as the in-game headquarters for Game Freak, the development company responsible for creating the Pokemon games. Players who enter the building can meet characters who identify themselves as the developers, and in some versions of the building. Specific notable Game Freak employees appear as characters who can be spoken to and who provide dialogue acknowledging their role in making the games the player is currently playing. This kind of fourth wall acknowledgement is a recurring tradition in the Pokemon series, one that goes back to the original games where Game Freak's offices could also be found tucked into the game world. The developers have consistently placed versions of themselves inside the worlds they create, a subtle acknowledgement of the relationship between the people who build the world and the people who inhabit it. In Castelia specifically, the Game Freak building functions as a genuine in-game destination, a place where the frame of the fiction becomes permeable and the developers can speak to the players directly. The tradition of including Game Freak in the game world is one of the warmer, recurring details in the franchise, a humanizing touch that reminds players that the games they have loved across years and generations were made by real people with real identities who are aware of who is playing and what the experience means. Finding Game Freak in Castelia City is finding the people who built Unova inside the city they built, a quiet and self-aware celebration of the creative act that made all of it possible. Xerneas is the box legendary of Pokemon X, a fairy-type Pokemon whose design centers on a majestic deer with colorful crystalline antlers that glow in a distinctive pattern when the Pokemon is active. Its counterpart Yveltal and its thematic role in the narrative of X and Y are well established among players who experienced that generation, and Xerneas in particular became associated with the vivid and colorful antler display that defined its visual identity. What many players did not notice is that Xerneas has two distinct visual modes, and that only one of them is visible during battle. In its active mode, which is the form players see during battle and in certain narrative cutscenes, Xerneas's antlers glow with the full spectrum of colors that made the Pokemon iconic. This active mode is the version most players associate with the creature, and the version most prominently displayed in promotional materials. Outside of battle, Xerneas exists in its neutral mode, in which the brilliant colors of its antlers are absent. In neutral mode, the antlers appear pale white, drained of the chromatic energy that characterizes the active form. The Pokemon still carries itself with the graceful bearing of its active mode, but the visual signature that most players associate with it is simply not present. The transformation between modes is seamless in narrative terms, but creates a notable visual difference that most casual players never registered. The two modes of Xerneas reflect something embedded in the creature's lore about the nature of its power and presence. The active mode colors are associated with the energy that Xerneas grants to living things, the life force it can share or withhold. Neutral mode represents Xerneas at rest, its power held in reserve. Most players saw only the active mode, the Xerneas in full expression, and never encountered the quieter version that exists between its moments of engagement with the world. The naming system that the Heart Gold and Soul Silver games use for the rival character includes a small detail that reveals something about the game's own awareness of their dual nature. In the original Gold and Silver, the rival's default name was selected from a specific pool of options, and the automatic name suggestion feature gave players a consistent experience across both versions of the games. This was standard practice for the franchise. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, if a player leaves the rival's name completely blank when prompted to enter it and simply hits the confirm button without typing anything, the game generates a default name rather than leaving the field empty. The default name it suggests is version specific. Players who try this in Heart Gold will see the name Heart Offered as the rival's default. Players who try the same thing in Soul Silver will see the name Soul. The version title is embedded in the rival's suggested name, a quiet acknowledgement that the two versions of the same story understand which version they are. This is a very small design detail with essentially no gameplay consequence, but it represents the kind of attention to the complete player experience that the franchise has consistently shown across its history. The developers thought about what would happen when a player left the name field blank, and they made a decision about what that silence should produce. The decision they made connected the automatic suggestion to the specific version the player was holding, creating a moment of resonance between the game's title and the experience of playing it. Players who discovered this accidentally, or who were testing the name entry system without expecting anything interesting, encountered a small surprise. The game knew what it was. It had embedded that knowledge in the name it offered when the player gave it no other instruction. Heart Gold offered a heart, Soul Silver offered a soul. The titles became names. The encounter conditions for legendary Pokémon in the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum games created an unusual swap between Cresselia and Rotom that has already been touched on regarding Rotom's legendary music. But the flip side of that swap is worth examining as its own complete detail. Cresselia is a genuine legendary Pokémon, classified in that category by the game's internal logic and by the narrative significance of its role in the Full Moon Island event. Despite this status, when players encounter Cresselia in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, the music that plays is the standard wild Pokémon battle theme rather than the legendary encounter theme. Every other legendary Pokémon in those games triggers the special music. Cresselia receives the ordinary one. The swap that gave Rotom the legendary music simultaneously gave Cresselia the wild Pokémon music, creating a situation where neither creature's encounter matched what the design presumably intended. For players who encountered Cresselia expecting the musical cue that would signal a legendary encounter and heard the ordinary theme instead, the experience was subtly deflating. The music that the game uses to communicate significance failed to arrive at precisely the moment it should have. The encounter happened, the legendary stood there, and the soundtrack told the player they were in an ordinary battle, not a special one. The correction of this audio swap in later versions restored the appropriate musical assignment. But for players who experienced the original Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum in their initial state, Cresselia arrived to the wrong music, and Rotom arrived to the right one. The legendary felt ordinary, and the ordinary felt legendary, and the reason was simply that two files were placed in the wrong folders. Ice is one of the original types of the Pokémon franchise, present from the first generation, with Pokémon like Jynx and Lapras, and Dugong occupying it. The type has a visual identity and a mechanical identity that are both well established, associated with cold environments, defensive resilience against certain types, and a distinctive palette of frozen and crystalline designs. Players from the first generation onward associated Ice type with specific creatures and specific locations in the game world. Despite the type's presence from the beginning, something specific about how it was implemented in the first two generations went unremarked for years. There was no pure Ice-type Pokemon introduced until the third generation. Every Ice-type Pokemon in the first two generations was dual-typed, carrying Ice alongside Water or Psychic or another type. Jinx is Ice and Psychic. Lapras is Water and Ice. Dugong is Water and Ice. Articuno is Ice and Flying. Cloyster is Water and Ice. The pure Ice type, a Pokemon with no secondary typing to dilute or complicate the Ice identity, did not appear until Ruby and Sapphire arrived with Glalie, a pure Ice type introduced in Hoenn. This is the kind of absence that becomes visible only when you ask the right question. For players who accepted the early Ice types without analyzing their secondary typings, there was no noticeable gap. But for players who wondered why a type that had been present since the beginning had never produced a pure example, the answer is a somewhat surprising accounting of the distribution of types across the first 20-plus years of the franchise. Ice was there from the start. It just always shared itself with another type, until the third generation finally produced a Pokemon that belonged to it alone. The bug type occupies an interesting position in the Pokemon franchise as one of the most commonly encountered types in the early stages of every game, populating the grass and forests near the starting towns and serving as the Pokemon most likely to appear in the first several routes of any new region. Bug types are abundant, varied, and often serve as the training Pokemon for new players learning the game's catching and battling mechanics. In competitive play, the type has historically been underrepresented among the most powerful and useful Pokemon. Among the legendary Pokemon category, the bug type is notable for a specific gap in its representation. Despite the franchise spanning 9 generations and introducing hundreds of legendary and mythical Pokemon across that span, there is still no legendary Pokemon that is a pure bug type or has bug as a primary component of its legendary identity without being mythical or a form changer. Genesect is mythical rather than legendary. Shedinja's classification places it outside the legendary category entirely. The legendary designation, with its connotations of exceptional power and cosmological significance, has not yet been applied to a bug-type Pokemon in the straightforward way it has been applied to types like Dragon and Psychic and Water. This gap is notable partly because bug types are so common in the early game, and partly because the contrast between the type's abundant presence at low levels and its complete absence from the legendary tier creates one of the stranger asymmetries in the franchise's type distribution. Players who cataloged legendaries by type and noticed the absence were correct to find it unusual. The franchise has had many opportunities to introduce a legendary bug type and has not yet done so, leaving the type in a position unique among the original types of the game. Among the sea lion Pokemon in the franchise, there is a small group defined by that specific animal inspiration. Sea lions appear in multiple generations through Pokemon, whose designs draw directly from the distinctive features of those real-world marine mammals, the large round bodies, the distinctive facial structures, and the semi-aquatic lifestyle. Players who look at Seal, Dugong, and Poplio together will notice the shared inspiration. Though the 3 Pokemon were introduced in different generations and carry different typings and functional identities. Seal and its evolution Dugong are water-type Pokemon from the first generation, among the earliest examples of the franchise drawing from marine mammal biology for creature inspiration. Their designs capture the round, sleek quality of real sea lions and seals, though Dugong in particular carries a more stylized interpretation. Poplio, introduced in the 7th generation as a water-type starter, brings a different aesthetic sensibility to the same animal inspiration, emphasizing performance and circus imagery alongside the underlying sea lion biology. These 3 are the only sea lion Pokemon in the entire franchise. Across 9 generations and hundreds of creatures, the specific niche of the sea lion has been occupied exclusively by those 3. This makes them a small and precisely defined group within the broader catalog of water-type Pokemon, a set united not by type or generation or mechanical function, but purely by the shared animal they draw from. The specificity of that shared inspiration is the kind of thing that becomes interesting when you ask how many ways the franchise has found to represent any given animal across its history. Some animals appear many times through different generations and different interpretations. The sea lion has appeared 3 times and 3 times only, spread across 4 generations of games, creating a small and complete set that has not been added to despite the franchise's continued expansion. Spectrier is a ghost-type legendary Pokémon introduced in the 8th generation as part of the Crown Tundra expansion for Sword and Shield. It is one of 2 legendary horses that the expansion centered on, the other being the Ice-type Glastrier. Both horses can be fused with the small crown legendary Calyrex, and the choice of which horse to pursue determines certain aspects of the expanded narrative of the expansion. Among ghost-type Pokémon across all generations, Spectrier holds a specific record. It has the highest base speed stat of any ghost-type Pokémon. Speed is one of the most strategically significant stats in the battle system, determining which Pokémon acts first in any given turn, and making high speed a significant competitive advantage. For a type that includes creatures like Gengar and Dragapult and other fast ghost types, holding the record for the highest speed among them places Spectrier at the top of a competitive category defined by quickness. Spectrier also holds a different kind of distinction connected to the circumstances of how players can obtain it. Calyrex, the small psychic and grass-type legendary that connects the 2 horses, exists in the game in a fused state with whichever horse the player chooses. When players encounter the fused Calyrex on horseback, it is technically Spectrier or Glastrier wearing Calyrex, and the game treats the encounter as a single Pokémon that is actually 2. This makes Spectrier, or its partner depending on the player's choice, the only Pokémon that players can catch while it is currently fused with another Pokémon, mid-fusion capture being a mechanical condition that exists nowhere else in the series. The layout of Santaloon Forest in the Kalos region will feel immediately familiar to any player who spent significant time in the original Kanto region games. Santaloon Forest is the first forested area players move through in Pokémon X and Y, a bug-type dense woodland that functions as the game's introductory nature route and sets the tone for the Kalos region's approach to early game exploration. Players encounter it fresh and move through it without necessarily comparing its layout to anything they have seen before. The layout of Santaloon Forest is an exact 1-to-1 copy of Viridian Forest from the Kanto region. The structural dimensions, the path configurations, the placement of trees and open areas, all of it maps directly onto the layout of the forest that Kanto trainers walked through at the beginning of their own journeys. This is not a rough approximation or a thematic echo. It is the same floor plan, recreated in a different game in a different region, placed at the same structural position in the new adventure. The deliberate replication of Viridian Forest's layout in Santaloon Forest is a design choice that functions as a quiet acknowledgement for veteran players while remaining completely transparent to players experiencing the franchise for the first time. A new player moves through Santaloon Forest and experiences it as the opening forest of their Kalos adventure, nothing more. A returning player who spent hours in Viridian Forest navigating that specific layout with its specific turns and open areas will feel a recognition that is architectural rather than visual, a spatial memory activating in a new context. This kind of embedded reference for veteran players, one that is not explained or highlighted by the game itself, is a recurring feature of how the Pokémon franchise acknowledges its own history. The references are there for those who will feel them, invisible to those who won't, and never intrusive enough to disrupt the experience for either group. The Spear Pillar in the Sinnoh region is one of the most narratively significant locations in the 4th generation games, the ancient summit at the peak of Mount Coronet where the dimensional disturbance that drives the game's climax occurs. It is an outdoor location open to the sky, and its visual presentation emphasizes its altitude and exposure. a space at the edge of the sky where the boundaries between dimensions become unstable. As an outdoor location, it should, in principle, be accessible through the same travel methods that connect other outdoor locations across the Sinnoh region. Players who attempt to use the move Fly while standing at Spear Pillar discover that the game prevents it. Despite being an outdoor location with no visible roof or enclosure that would logically prevent aerial travel, Spear Pillar is flagged in the game's mechanics as a no-fly zone, a location from which players cannot use Fly to depart. The restriction applies absolutely, and the reason for it is never explained within the game's narrative. The practical reason is almost certainly developmental rather than lore-based. Allowing players to fly directly from Spear Pillar would create sequence issues with the game's progression flags and the narrative events tied to the location, bypassing required story beats, or creating edge cases the developers chose to avoid by simply making the move unavailable. The restriction is a practical solution to a developmental problem, implemented through a blunt prohibition rather than a more elegant narrative justification. What makes the restriction mildly charming rather than simply frustrating is the question it raises about the logic of an outdoor space that prevents flight. The Spear Pillar is the highest point in Sinnoh, a literal summit above the clouds. It is the most aerial location in the game, and it is the one outdoor place from which you categorically cannot fly. The contradiction between the location's visual suggestion and its mechanical reality is a small example of the gaps that appear when game logic and world logic operate by different rules. Among the starter Pokemon introduced across all 9 generations, 2 specific starters stand out for having dual typings at their base stage, before evolution has had any chance to change or expand their type. Most starter Pokemon begin their journey as a pure type, grass or fire or water, gaining complexity through evolution as they grow into their final forms. The dual-typed starters are exceptions to this standard pattern, arriving already carrying a secondary type alongside their primary one. Those 2 dual-typed base starters are Bulbasaur and Rowlet. Bulbasaur, the grass and poison type from the first generation, begins its journey already carrying both types simultaneously. Rowlet, the grass and flying type from the 7th generation, does the same. Both begin as dual types. Both carry grass as their primary type. The 2 starters that diverge from the single type starter baseline share the same primary typing, creating a quiet symmetry between 2 creatures introduced 6 generations apart. This alignment between the 2 dual-typed base starters is the kind of connection that rewards players who organize their knowledge of the franchise and ask specific structural questions about what patterns emerge across generations. Neither Bulbasaur's dual type nor Rowlet's dual type is a secret or an obscure piece of information. But the connection between the 2, the fact that the only 2 starter Pokemon to begin with dual typings both share the grass type, is the kind of pattern that becomes visible only when you ask about it directly. The grass typing itself connects both Pokemon to the broader thematic identity of the grass type as something that grows and changes and gains complexity over time. That both dual-type starters begin with grass and then expand outward in different directions, one toward poison and one toward flying, reflects something about grass as a foundation for further combination. Zacian and Zamazenta are the box legendary Pokemon of Sword and Shield, 2 canine creatures based on ancient warriors and the weapons they carry. Zacian holds a sword in its mouth. Zamazenta carries a shield as part of its body. Their designs are explicitly martial, their identities rooted in the imagery of combat and the honorable use of weapons in defense of something worth protecting. Players who met them through the Sword and Shield narrative understood their connection to the game's thematic exploration of battles fought and friendships maintained across time. Both Zacian and Zamazenta are categorized in the Pokédex under the same species classification. The Pokédex lists both of them as the warrior Pokemon. This shared category is one of the more precise design alignments in the franchise, connecting 2 legendaries whose entire visual and narrative identity is built around the concept of warrior spirit into a single official species designation that makes their connection explicit. They are both warriors. They are categorized as warriors. The design and the designation are in complete agreement. The warrior Pokemon designation also carries a specific weight within the franchise's traditions around species names. Many species names are poetic or metaphorical, describing what a Pokemon suggests or resembles rather than what it literally is. Zacian and Zamazenta's species name is unusual in its directness, a plain statement of what they are rather than an evocative image of what they evoke. They fight, they guard, they embody the warrior tradition. The Pokédex simply acknowledges that directly. For players who follow the species names in the Pokédex as part of how they understand and remember the Pokemon they encounter, finding that both box legendaries of a game called Sword and Shield share the species name Warrior Pokemon is one of those moments of complete thematic coherence that the franchise occasionally achieves. The title, the designs, the species name, and the narrative all say the same thing about what these creatures are. Pokemon Black and White, the 5th generation games released for the Nintendo Ds, introduced a particularly ambitious approach to the legendary Pokemon roster that distinguished them structurally from every other generation in the series. The 5th generation's central narrative revolved around a complex thematic exploration of truth and ideals, and the legendary Pokemon that populated the Unova region were organized with unusual deliberateness around those themes. What made the 5th generation's legendary structure unique was the number of distinct legendary groups it contained. While previous generations typically featured one primary legendary trio and one or two additional standalone or paired legendaries, Black and White organized its legendary Pokemon into 3 separate and fully distinct legendary groups. Each group had its own thematic identity, its own internal relationships, and its own place within the larger mythology of the Unova region. 3 complete groups within a single generation was a density of legendary organization that no other mainline game matched. The 3 groups were the Tao Trio, consisting of Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, the forces of nature, the elemental trio of Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, and the Swords of Justice, the quartet of Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo. Each group had distinct visual identities, distinct roles in the region's ecology and mythology, and distinct mechanical identities within the battle system. The organization was thorough enough that it almost felt like 3 separate legendary stories had been woven into a single game. The ambitious scope of Black and White's legendary roster reflected the generation's broader design philosophy, which pushed harder on thematic complexity and narrative ambition than many generations had attempted before. The 3 legendary groups were part of an effort to build a denser and more coherent mythology for Unova than the regions that preceded it, and the result was a generation of legendary Pokemon whose internal organization was unlike anything else in the franchise's history. Lance is the champion of the Kanto region, a dragon master whose collection of Dragonite and other draconic Pokemon represents the peak of the trainer hierarchy in the original games. His battles in Red, Blue, and Yellow are among the most memorable encounters in the franchise, partly because of the visual drama of fighting powerful dragon types, and partly because Lance himself projects a sense of confident authority that makes defeating him feel genuinely meaningful. One of Lance's Dragonite in the original Red, Green, and Blue games has a problem. During the battle, this Dragonite uses the move Barrier. In the first generation of games, Barrier is not a move that Dragonite can legitimately learn through any available method. It cannot be taught to Dragonite through TM or level up. It cannot be passed down through breeding in a generation where breeding did not yet exist. And no other mechanism exists within the rules of the first generation games that would allow Dragonite to know Barrier. Lance's Dragonite knows a move it has no legitimate way of knowing. This makes it, in the technical vocabulary of the competitive Pokemon community, an illegal Pokemon, a creature whose current move set exceeds what the rules of the game permit. The champion of Kanto, the pinnacle of the trainer hierarchy, the person players travel the entire region to be strong enough to face, is using a Pokemon that is breaking the game's own rules. Whether this was a deliberate design choice by the developers to make Lance's team feel more threatening, or simply an oversight in the early days of the franchise before strict legality became a concern. The result is the same. Lance cheats. The champion cheats. And unless you know that Dragonite cannot legitimately learn Barrier in Generation 1, you would never know. The anime series for Pokemon has maintained across its long run a general rule that separates the world of the anime from the more specific lore surrounding legendary Pokemon. Legendaries appear in the movies and in certain pivotal episodes, but they are treated as beings fundamentally apart from the ordinary world of trainer competitions and gym challenges. The Pokemon League, the formal tournament structure of the franchise, is populated by trainers with teams of non-legendary Pokemon, and the competitions themselves proceed within an implicit understanding that legendary Pokemon are simply not the kind of creatures you bring to a sanctioned tournament. There is a specific episode of the anime series called An Old Family Blend that established a quiet exception to this understanding. In the episode, a random background trainer, who is not a main character and who receives no particular focus from the narrative, is shown registering his Pokemon for the Sinnoh League competition. Among his registered Pokemon is a Heatran, a legendary steel and fire type from the 4th generation associated with volcanic environments and the maintenance of the underground fire that keeps the world's geology active. This moment is the first time in the anime series that a standard trainer, someone who is not a major character and not subject to the special rules that govern the main character's relationships with legendary Pokemon, is shown using a legendary in an official competition context. The inclusion of Heatran in a random trainer's roster is brief, unremarked, and almost certainly unintended as a significant narrative moment, but it established a precedent within the anime's own internal rules about what ordinary trainers can do, and it did so almost accidentally as a background detail in a scene focused on something else entirely. Among the various battle-enhancing mechanics that the 7th generation introduced to the Pokémon series, the Z-move system stands out as one of the most elaborate and visually distinctive. Z-moves are powerful attacks that require a specific Z-crystal and the right Pokemon or move type to activate, and they can only be used once per battle. The system was designed to give each trainer a dramatic and powerful option reserved for the most critical moments of a fight, and it expanded the tactical vocabulary of competitive play significantly. Most Pokemon that can use Z-moves have access to exactly one, determined by their species or their typing. The standard distribution of Z-move access is 1 per Pokemon, with the full pool of type-based Z-moves and species-specific Z-moves giving each creature a single option for the most powerful move available to them. This 1 per Pokemon distribution is consistent enough that it functions as an understood standard across most of the roster. Pikachu is the sole exception. In the 7th generation games, Pikachu is the only Pokemon in the game that has access to 2 different Z moves. The 2 available to Pikachu are Catastropica, derived from Volt Tackle, and Pika Papau, derived from Pika moves in a manner specific to certain versions of Pikachu obtained through events. No other Pokemon in the 7th generation has access to 2 Z moves. Pikachu stands alone in that position, the only member of the roster with 2 entries in the category that every other eligible Pokemon fills with 1. This is consistent with Pikachu's broader status as the franchise's mascot, a creature that periodically receives mechanical special treatment that reflects its unique commercial and cultural position within the series. The dual Z-move access in the 7th generation is one of several generation-specific privileges that Pikachu has received over the years, each one encoding in game mechanics the special status that the creature holds outside them. The beta version of Pokémon Gold and Silver that has been partially preserved and examined by fans and researchers offers a window into how the 2nd generation games might have looked had certain design decisions gone differently. Beta materials for the Pokemon games generally remain private property of the developers, but specific early versions have become accessible through various means over the years, revealing creature designs that were changed before the final games were released. Among the most memorable beta discoveries from the Gold and Silver era is an early design for Octillery, the water-type cephalopod Pokemon that players can obtain in the final games through trading or evolving its pre-evolution. Octillery, in its final form, is a red octopus with a rotund body and a design that draws from the visual vocabulary of tanks and artillery, its round body and wide mouth suggesting a cannon or barrel. The artillery reference is present, but interpreted through organic cephalopod forms. In the 1997 beta version of the game, Octillery's design was considerably more literal about its military inspiration. The early design had Octillery wearing an actual metal helmet and carrying actual armor, making it look much more explicitly like a tank or an armored vehicle that happened to also be an octopus. The final version filtered that military imagery through the natural forms of the creature's cephalopod biology, making it recognizable as an animal first and a weapon reference second. The beta version made the weapon reference primary, resulting in something that felt more like a creature dressed in military equipment than a creature that expressed military qualities through its natural body. The shift from the armored, explicitly military beta design to the more naturalistic final version reflects the broader design evolution that many early Pokemon underwent as Game Freak developed a clearer sense of what they wanted the creatures in their world to feel like. The world works best when its creatures feel like living things that happen to suggest other ideas, rather than like objects or costumes that have been given biological attributes. The legendary horses Glastrier and Spectrier were introduced alongside Calyrex in the Crown Tundra expansion of Sword and Shield. The two horses represent opposite elemental forces, ice in the case of Glastrier and ghost in the case of Spectrier, and players are required to choose which horse to pursue during the expansion's main story, determining which one becomes available for capture in their playthrough. The two typings seem like a simple pair of thematic opposites, cold and spectral, physical and incorporeal. There is a specific reason why Glastrier is ice type and Spectrier is ghost type that goes beyond simple thematic opposition. Calyrex itself is a grass and psychic type Pokemon. Ice type attacks are super effective against grass type Pokemon. Ghost type attacks are super effective against psychic type Pokemon. The two horses that Calyrex takes as mounts are precisely the two types that are most effective against the two types that Calyrex itself carries. This design choice creates a layered relationship between Calyrex and its potential mounts, one in which the horses that bond with Calyrex are the creature's best positioned to destroy it. The symbiosis between Calyrex and whichever horse it fuses with is also a structural vulnerability, the horse's power being the exact weakness that the psychic grass Pokemon would be most susceptible to. Whether the designers intended this to carry a specific narrative weight about dependency and vulnerability, or whether it is simply a precision designed structural irony. The alignment is precise enough to feel entirely intentional. The relationship adds a dimension to the Crown Tundra's story about the ancient king and its ancient steed that most players move through without fully registering. Calyrex bonds with a creature that could defeat it. The strength of the partnership is inseparable from the structural risk that the partnership represents. The horse and the king need each other. The horse and the king are also each other's greatest vulnerabilities. Gym Leader Roxanne in the Hone region specializes in rock-type Pokemon and operates the first gym that players challenge in the Hone games, serving as the introductory challenge in a game set in a region defined by its geographical variety. Roxanne herself is presented as a studious and methodical trainer, someone who approaches battling with the precision of a student who takes her craft seriously. Her design communicates expertise and calm confidence. In the original Emerald version of the Hone games, Roxanne's team carries a detail that most players would never think to check unless they played through the game multiple times and paid close attention to the gender composition of her Pokemon across different encounters. This detail concerns the gender assignment of her team members, not their types, or their levels, or their movesets. In the initial gym battle against Roxanne and Emerald, every single Pokemon on her team is female. The lineup is uniformly one gender. When players who have already defeated her and progressed significantly through the game challenge her to a rematch, the composition shifts entirely. Every single Pokemon on her rematch team is male, a complete reversal of the gender balance in her initial lineup. The only change from initial battle to rematch, beyond the expected level increases, is the complete swap of every team member's gender from female to exclusively male. Why this detail exists in the game is unknown, and the effect is invisible to players who fight Roxanne once without examining the gender of her Pokemon. It is the kind of mechanical detail that becomes visible only when someone is specifically looking for it, cataloging trainer teams not just by type and level, but by the additional dimensions that most players never consider. Clamperl is a water-type Pokemon introduced in the third generation, a small bivalve creature that carries within its shell the potential to evolve into one of two different Pokemon. Its evolutionary path represents one of the design options that the franchise has used occasionally to create branching evolution systems, where a single base Pokemon can develop into multiple distinct final forms depending on the conditions applied during its evolution. What makes Clamperl's evolutionary record specifically notable is the mechanism it uses to achieve its branching evolution. Clamperl evolves by being traded while it is holding a specific item. This trade while holding item mechanic is shared with several other Pokemon in the franchise, including Slowpoke's evolution into Slowking and various other trade evolutions that require held items. The mechanic itself is not unique. What is unique about Clamperl is that it is the only Pokemon in the entire franchise that evolves by being traded while holding one of two completely different items, each one leading to a different final form. Holding the Deep Sea Tooth while being traded produces Huntail. Holding the Deep Sea Scale while being traded produces Gorbis. The two items produce two entirely different Pokemon, both requiring the same trade mechanic but diverging at the point of the held item. No other Pokemon in the entire franchise shares this specific configuration. Other branching evolutions exist, but they use different trigger mechanisms. Other trade evolutions with held items exist, but they produce only one outcome. Clamperl occupies a precise intersection of those two design traditions, a branching evolution achieved through the same mechanism, but diverging at the choice of held item. Its evolutionary record is unique in the exact way that most players never think to ask about. The signature move of Lucario, Aura Sphere, is one of the most recognizable special attacks in the franchise. A focused ball of fighting energy launched from the hands toward the opponent. Lucario itself is one of the most popular and prominent Pokemon introduced in the fourth generation, a steel and fighting type with an exceptionally devoted fan base and a significant presence in competitive play, in the anime, and in the broader franchise merchandise. Players who are familiar with the fighting game Street Fighter will notice something specific about Aura Sphere's visual presentation and its Japanese name. In Street Fighter, the iconic move of the character Ryu is the Hadoken, a projectile attack consisting of a compressed ball of focused energy launched from the hands toward the opponent. The visual concept is nearly identical to Aura Sphere, two fighters who focus their internal energy into a sphere and project it forward as a ranged attack. The Japanese name for Aura Sphere is Hadoden, a name that is not merely visually similar to Street Fighter's Hadoken, but is a direct phonological reference to it. The first two syllables, Hadu, are shared between the two move names, and the reference is clear enough that it functions as an explicit acknowledgement of the inspiration rather than an accidental resemblance. Someone at Game Freak or the Pokémon Company decided to name the move in a way that explicitly pointed toward the Street Fighter reference, encoding the connection in the name itself. For players who knew both franchises, the reference was recognizable in the move's visual design and confirmed in the Japanese name. For players who encountered it purely within the Pokemon context, Aura's Sphere was simply a powerful special fighting move. The reference operates at the level it is intended to operate, visible to those who will see it, and invisible to those who have no context for it. In the first generation of Pokemon games, the artificial intelligence governing trainer opponents does not consume power points when it uses moves. Power points are the resource that limits how many times a Pokemon can use any given move in battle. A Pokemon with 15 power points assigned to a particular attack can use that attack 15 times before it runs out and becomes unable to use it until it is restored. This limitation applies to the player's Pokemon throughout the games. Trainer Pokemon in the first generation do not share this limitation. They can use their moves indefinitely. With no power point drain occurring for moves executed by the trainers, the player battles. This means that in any battle against a first-generation trainer, if the player has sufficient healing resources to sustain their Pokemon through unlimited attacks from the opponent's side, the battle can in theory continue indefinitely. The opponent will never struggle, never run out of moves, never be forced into the desperate fallback position of using the universal move struggle. The practical consequence of this mechanic is limited because most players do not have infinite healing items and do not choose to deliberately extend battles beyond their natural conclusion. But the theoretical implication is genuine. Battles against trainers in the first generation could go on literally forever as long as the player kept healing. The opponent's Pokemon would simply keep using their moves with no resource cost, patient and inexhaustible, for as long as the player chose to continue. This is one of those first-generation mechanical facts that feels slightly surreal when stated directly, a consequence of the young franchise's resource allocation for the artificial intelligence system that governs trainer behavior. The player is limited by resources. The trainer is not. The asymmetry is complete, and it remains one of the more unexpected artifacts of how the original games were built. The relationship between legendary Pokemon and the breeding system in the mainline games has always maintained a consistent restriction. Legendary Pokemon cannot breed. This rule applies universally across the mainline series, with extremely limited exceptions. And it reflects the design logic that legendaries are singular and exceptional beings whose existence is not reproduced through normal biological processes. Placing them in the daycare or at a breeder produces no eggs, and the attempted breeding simply fails without producing any offspring. The anime adaptation of the Pokemon story has operated with considerably more freedom in how it handles certain elements of the game's rules, and legendary Pokemon have been handled differently in the anime than in the games throughout the series' run. The anime has shown legendaries being encountered and befriended by humans in ways that the games typically do not accommodate, and some aspects of the lore around legendaries are handled loosely in the animated series. One specific episode provides direct visual evidence of a legendary Pokemon having offspring, something the games categorically state cannot happen. In an episode of the anime, a baby Lugia appears as a significant plot element, a young Lugia whose existence implies that Lugia can reproduce and have young. This is a direct contradiction of the breeding rules established in the mainline games, where Lugia is a legendary that cannot produce eggs. Baby Lugia remains one of the most prominent examples of the anime departing from established game lore in a way that carries genuine narrative implications, because the existence of a baby legendary implies an entirely different understanding of legendary Pokemon as a category, one in which they are not singular and unreplicable, but potentially capable of producing offspring. The two versions of the franchise simply hold different positions on this question, and neither one has made an effort to reconcile them. Tauros has been a part of the Pokemon franchise since the first generation, one of the original 151, a normal type bull Pokemon whose design draws from the American bison and whose battle utility in the competitive meta of the first generation made it one of the more significant creatures in early competitive Pokemon history. Its design was simple and direct, a powerful bull with 3 tails and an aggressive charging stance that communicated its battle identity clearly. The 8th generation introduced the concept of Paldean regional variants for Tauros, creating alternate versions of the original bull based on the different cultural and environmental influences of the Paldea region. This was not unusual in itself, as regional variants had been part of the franchise since the 7th generation introduced the Alolan forms. What was unusual about the Paldean Tauros variants was the number of distinct forms they represented. Paldea introduced three completely different regional forms of Tauros within a single generation. The Paldean Combat breed carries a fighting type. The Paldean Blaze breed carries fighting and fire types. The Paldean Aqua breed carries fighting and water types. Three separate forms, each with distinct secondary typing and visual design, all introduced in the same generation, and all representing variants of the same original Pokémon. No other Pokémon in the franchise has received three completely different regional forms in a single generation. Other Pokémon have received two forms across a generation, and some have received additional forms in subsequent games, but the simultaneous introduction of three distinct regional forms within one generation is unique to Tauros in the 9th generation. The original Bison Pokémon from Generation 1 received more new forms at once than any other Pokémon has at any point in the franchise's history. There are moments in these quiet hours before sleep where the mind moves more freely through the things it knows, finding new connections between old information, noticing patterns that the activity of the day keeps too busy to catch. The Pokémon franchise is a particularly rich space for this kind of noticing because it has been built across so many years with so much care, and the care shows in the specific places it was applied. These are not facts that change how the games play when you go back to them. Knowing that Registeel lacks a 200 stat won't make your battle against it feel different. Knowing that Nurse Joy was named after a Japanese medical designation won't change how you feel when she heals your team after a difficult stretch. But these facts change how the world feels, adding density and deliberateness to a franchise whose depth most players only partially encounter during any single playthrough. The designers who built these games were paying attention to layers that most players would never consciously register. They built systems of near infinite variety into single Pokémon designs. They encoded names with layers of meaning in multiple languages. They placed their own offices inside the worlds they created and left their names in the credits of games that millions of people played without wondering very much about who made them. That care, applied consistently across decades of development, is part of what has made this franchise feel like something worth returning to. The peculiar gap between Cresselia and the legendary encounter music is part of a broader pattern of interesting mistakes and oversights from the 4th generation games that ended up defining certain aspects of how players remember those games. Rotom's music, Cresselia's music, these two swapped files created two separate encounters that were memorable in different ways precisely because they got something wrong. The game communicated something unintended, and the unintended communication stayed with players. This quality, where an error becomes part of the remembered experience, is one of the more interesting dynamics in game preservation. Pokémon games that have been played by enough people over enough time generate a collective memory of the experience that includes its imperfections. The bugs are part of the texture. The glitches are part of the history. Generation 1's inverted focus energy, Generation 2's random twins AI, Generation 4's swapped battle music. These mistakes are documented alongside the intentional design choices and remembered with equivalent interest by the people who encountered them. There is a sense in which the imperfections of the Pokémon games are as much a part of what makes them worth studying as their intentional choices. A perfect game would not invite the same kind of archaeological curiosity that leads players to examine trainer AI behavior or test catch rate mechanics or count the characters in a game's official title. The imperfections create entry points, places where the world's rules fail to maintain themselves, and through that failure reveal something about how the rules were built. The franchise's treatment of the bug type across legendary Pokemon reveals something about how type identity has been curated across generations in ways that reflect both practical and aesthetic priorities. Bug types are among the most common early game encounters, present in virtually every regional early route associated with youth and development in the first stages of a trainer's journey. In narrative terms, bug types belong to the beginning. Legendary Pokemon occupy the opposite narrative space. They are the exceptional, the singular, the creatures whose existence marks the thresholds between ordinary experience and something much larger. Their power and significance are defined precisely by their distance from the ordinary encounters of the early routes. The structural opposition between bug types and legendary status creates a design tension that the franchise has consistently resolved in favor of that distance. The few bug type Pokemon that have approached legendary status, like Genesect in its mythical classification, have generally been positioned in ways that acknowledge the tension rather than simply dissolving it. Genesect is a fossil organism rebuilt and weaponized, a scientific creation that sits at the intersection of natural vulnerability and artificial power. Its legendary adjacent status comes from what was done to it rather than from what it naturally is. The absence of a straightforward legendary bug type, 9 generations in, is a design choice that reflects the ongoing maintenance of that structural opposition between the type's associations with ordinary early experiences and the exceptional status that legendary classification implies. Whether any future generation will bridge that gap is genuinely unknown, and the waiting for it is itself part of how the franchise maintains interest across the enormous catalog it has accumulated. The two legendary horses introduced in Crown Tundra and the small crown Pokemon they bond with represent one of the more mechanically unusual legendary structures in the franchise's history. The fused forms of Calyrex with either Glastrier or Spectrier function as distinct Pokemon with different stat distributions, different type combinations, and different competitive identities from the unfused versions of the same creatures. The fusion system creates 6 distinct states from 3 Pokemon, the 3 unfused forms, and the 2 fused combinations, plus the catch scenario during which the fusion exists as a single capturable entity. The lore surrounding Calyrex and its ancient horse connects to one of the older thematic threads in the franchise's approach to legendary Pokemon. The idea that the most powerful legendaries are not simply powerful in isolation, but are powerful through relationship. Calyrex without its horse is a diminished thing, its ancient power expressed only partially without the partner that amplifies it. The horse without Calyrex is powerful in a raw and directionless way. Together they form something that neither could be alone. This relationship dynamic, where legendary power is incomplete without partnership, is one of the more emotionally resonant ideas in the franchise's handling of its most powerful creatures. The mechanical expression of that idea through the fusion system gives the feeling of incompleteness a statistical reality. The fused Calyrex is simply a better battler than either component alone. The game makes the emotional truth of partnership into a number, and the number confirms what the lore says about why any of these creatures matter. The Crown Tundra as an expansion was built substantially around this kind of ancient relationship story, connections between legendary Pokemon and the human civilizations that knew them in older times. Calyrex and its horse fit into that larger narrative as the clearest example of what those ancient connections looked like when they were intact, when the legendary was not simply captured and trained, but genuinely bonded with something that made it whole. The connection between the move Aura Sphere, Lucario, and the broader question of what cultural references get embedded in the franchise reaches into a tradition that has been part of Pokemon since its earliest designs. The franchise has drawn consistently from martial arts, mythology, folklore, technology, and popular culture across every generation. And the references range from the subtle to the explicit, depending on how directly the designers chose to engage with their source material. Some references are abstract enough that they function as inspiration without being recognizable to most players. Others, like Orosphere's Hadoudan name, are specific enough that they function as direct acknowledgments of a source. The space between inspiration and acknowledgement is where most of the franchise's cultural references live, and navigating that space has been one of the defining challenges of Pokemon design across its history. The best examples of cultural reference in Pokemon design are the ones where knowing the reference enriches the experience without the reference being necessary to appreciate the design on its own terms. Lucario works as a Pokemon without knowing anything about Street Fighter. Or a Sphere functions as a move without understanding the Hadouken reference. Knowing the connection adds a layer that wasn't accessible before, but the layer it adds is one of resonance rather than revelation, a deepening of something that already worked. This principle, the idea that the best cultural references are additions rather than foundations, guides a lot of what makes Pokemon design successful at its best. The game never requires you to have a particular cultural background to understand or enjoy what it has built, but it rewards you, gently, for the background knowledge you happen to carry, offering small confirmations and expansions of meaning to players who bring particular frames of reference to the experience. The Game Freak building in Castelia City is one of several places across the franchise where the developers have placed themselves directly inside the world their games create. The tradition goes back to the very beginning, when the Pokemon games included Game Freak's actual office in the Celadon City area of Kanto, a building players could enter, and where the game's developers appeared as characters who acknowledged making the game the player was currently experiencing. This tradition of self-inclusion is one of the warmer and more unusual features of the franchise, reflecting a design sensibility that values transparency and humor about the relationship between creators and players. Most games maintain a strict separation between the world of the game and the world of the people who built it. Pokemon has consistently chosen to make that boundary permeable, placing the developers inside the worlds they create and allowing them to speak directly to the players who inhabit those worlds. The conversations players can have with the Game Freak characters in various games occasionally include specific acknowledgments of the development process, comments about what was difficult to build or what the team was proud of. These moments of transparency function as a kind of documentary commentary embedded in the fiction, the makers of the world describing what it was like to make it within the context of the world they made. For players who found these buildings and talked to the characters inside them, the experience carries a quality that is distinct from any other encounter in the games. You are not speaking with a fictional inhabitant of a fictional world. You are speaking with a representation of the person who built the wall you are standing in front of, the person who drew the tree you are standing under, the person who placed the encounter table that determines which Pokemon you find in the tall grass outside. The frame breaks, gently, and the game acknowledges itself. The National Pokédex number system that has organized every Pokemon introduced since the first generation represents one of the more quietly consequential design decisions in the franchise's history. Every Pokemon that has ever been officially introduced receives a number, and that number places the creature in a sequential list that functions as the backbone of the franchise's internal organization. The numbers matter in mechanical terms, in terms of how data is stored and accessed, and they also matter in a more cultural sense, as identifiers that fans use to discuss specific creatures across generations and language barriers. Celebi's Pokédex number is 251. This number marks it as the final entry in the second generation's expanded Pokédex, the last creature in the Johto Regional Pokédex, the final addition that brought the total count from the original 151 to the 251 that completed the second generation's contribution. The number 251 is a precise coordinate in the franchise's internal geography, locating Celebi at a specific threshold between what the franchise was and what it was becoming. The cape on Dada Zarude, carrying that specific number, is an active tribute embedded in a design detail, a tiny number printed on a cloth that connects a creature from the 9th generation to the creature it celebrates and the narrative of their shared film. The designers who put that number there were thinking about how a specific location in the franchise's internal catalog could carry emotional weight when recognized, how the number 251 is not just a position in a list, but a specific identity, the identity of Celebi, and how placing it on Dada Zaruti's cape would register meaningfully for anyone who carries that knowledge. This is the kind of detail that functions as a gift to the attentive, a reward for the kind of engagement that crosses generations and maintains awareness of the full catalog rather than just the current one. The franchise has always offered these kinds of cross-generational rewards, details that only become fully meaningful when held against the knowledge that earlier games provide. Dada Zarude's cape is one of the more precise and touching examples of that tradition. The complete move list available to any given Pokemon tells a story about what the designers believed that creature was capable of, and how they wanted players to think about and use it in battle. Most moves in any given Pokemon's move pool are straightforward, connected to the creature's type or its physical attributes in ways that feel logically appropriate. But occasionally, the move list contains something unexpected, a move whose presence requires explanation, because the connection to the Pokemon's design is not immediately obvious. Golurk's ability to use Fly is one of the more extreme examples of this kind of unexpected move availability. But it is not the only one in the franchise. Several Pokemon have moves in their pools that seem to contradict their physical design or their type identity, and in most cases there is an explanation that draws from either Pokédex lore, anime appearances, or the extended media of the franchise. The explanations vary in their elegance, some requiring a considerable suspension of the physical plausibility that the game usually maintains, others drawing on specific moments from outside the games that established a capability most players would never know to look for. The broader principle that Golurk's Fly availability illustrates is that the game's move system has always been built with some flexibility between visual design and mechanical possibility, allowing creatures to access moves that their appearance might not suggest if there is a narrative or lore justification for the connection. This flexibility creates occasional surprises, moments where the player discovers that a Pokemon they thought they understood completely can do something they didn't expect. The surprises are almost always explained once you look for the explanation, but the looking is itself part of what makes the franchise feel like a world with internal logic rather than a collection of arbitrary rules. The formal structure of the Pokemon League Challenge, the sequence of 8 gym badges leading to the Elite Four and the Champion, has been the backbone of the mainline series since the beginning. Players who have moved through this structure in multiple regions across multiple generations understand it as a standard framework, varied in its specific contents but consistent in its overall shape. 8 badges, 4 elite trainers, 1 champion. The sequence is reliable enough to feel like a natural law of the game world. Within that consistent structure, the gym leaders themselves represent one of the franchise's most enduring creative traditions, a series of characters who embody the diversity of Pokemon type specialization and trainer identity across each regional culture. Every region produces a different set of 8 gym leaders, each one associated with a specific type, a specific location, and a specific personality that reflects their approach to the art of training. The design space that a gym leader occupies is broad enough to accommodate enormous variety while remaining recognizable as a specific role. The tradition of gym leaders reflecting their specialization through their personality, their location, and their team is something that the franchise has maintained with varying levels of success across generations. The strongest gym leader designs are those where all 3 of those elements feel coherent, where the trainer's personality grows naturally from the type they use, where the location embodies the character of both the type and the person, and where the team is composed of creatures that feel both personally meaningful to the trainer and representative of the type's best qualities. Roxanne's rock specialization, combined with her scholarly approach, creates this kind of coherence. The hidden details of her team's gender composition add an additional layer that most players never find, but that the designers put there anyway. The gym leader tradition in Pokemon is essentially a series of brief character studies, each one giving the player a moment of personal encounter with someone who has built their life around a specific relationship with a specific kind of Pokemon. The facts hidden in those encounters, the surprising details that reward close attention, are part of how the franchise adds depth to what might otherwise be straightforward challenge checkpoints. Gym leaders are more than obstacles. They are residents of the world, characters with complete, if mostly unexpressed, inner lives. And the details that occasionally surface about them are glimpses of that completeness. The experience of returning to a Pokemon game you played years ago and noticing things you missed the first time is one of the more distinctive experiences the franchise offers. The games are long enough and detailed enough that a single playthrough, however attentive, leaves many things unexamined. The replay reveals the gaps, places where you moved through the world too quickly to notice what was there, moments where you were occupied with something else and failed to register a detail that was present throughout the experience. This quality of the franchise, its capacity to reward return visits with new discoveries, is connected to the depth of the detail work that the designers applied across every layer of the experience. The surface story doesn't change between playthroughs. The champion is still the champion. The villain's plan is still the same plan. The starter Pokemon you chose is still waiting in the same options as it always was. But the details beneath the story, the specific numbers and names and design choices that carry meaning beyond their functional roles, are available to a returning player in a way they weren't available the first time, because the first time you were moving forward, and the second time you can afford to slow down. The facts that reward slowing down are the ones this exploration has been moving through. They are not secrets in the sense of being deliberately hidden from most players. They are simply details that the normal pace of play doesn't create time for. The Enigma Berry's question mark is visible to anyone who looks at the item art. Bugsy's claim to have discovered Fury Cutter is audible to anyone who talks to him at the right moment. The question mark on Spinda spot generation is accessible to anyone who thinks to ask the right mathematical question about what determines the variation. The franchise has now existed long enough that the designers of its earliest games are no longer the only people building it. The teams that create new generations of Pokemon include people who grew up playing the games that defined the franchise, people for whom the original 151 are childhood memories rather than professional deliverables. This generational shift in who is building the games has produced a franchise that is increasingly capable of referencing and reflecting on its own history, building new layers of meaning into designs and details that draw on the accumulated depth of everything that came before. The Farigiraf name, as an anagram of Girafarig, is an example of this kind of self-aware historical engagement, creating an evolution whose name rearranges the letters of the original creature's palindromic name required knowing that the original name was a palindrome, valuing the wordplay it contained, and finding a way to continue that wordplay in the evolution's design without simply repeating it. The result is a relationship between two names spread across 6 generations of games. A connection that was either planned at the beginning and carried across 2 decades, or designed specifically to celebrate and extend something the original team created. Either way, the result is a small piece of franchise history that reflects the ongoing conversation between generations of designers and the world they are collectively maintaining. The palindrome exists in the 2nd generation. Its anagram evolution exists in the 8th. The gap between them is the gap between the franchise's beginning and its current maturity, and the connection across that gap is one of the more elegant examples of how the series has learned to be aware of its own depth. The Pokemon games are, at their best, a demonstration that meticulous attention can coexist with playfulness, that a game can be deeply serious about the quality of its construction while remaining entirely joyful in its surface experience. The children who first played these games and felt the particular thrill of catching their first Pikachu or defeating their first champion were not aware of the spin to spot mathematics or the Generation 1 focus energy bug. But those things were part of the world they were inhabiting, part of what made the world feel real and complete and worth returning to. The depth supported the surface, even when the surface was what most players could see. That relationship between visible experience and invisible craft is one of the most valuable lessons the franchise offers to anyone who thinks carefully about making things. You do not have to announce your care for it to do its work. You do not have to explain the layers for them to add depth. You do not have to surface the hidden details for them to contribute to the feeling that the world is genuinely, fully real. The care accumulates in the experience whether or not it is credited, and the experience is richer for every detail that was placed with intention, regardless of whether it was ever consciously noticed. The story of Pokemon's hidden facts is ultimately a story about what it means to take something seriously enough to build it all the way down, to keep adding specificity and meaning even to the parts that will never be examined, because the practice of thorough attention is its own justification and its own reward. And now, as the quiet of these hours deepens and the mind begins its own natural process of rest and integration, that practice has one more night to settle into the slow, unhurried space where the best things are kept. The Pokemon games have always been built with more layers than any single player is likely to encounter, more connections than any casual examination will reveal, more deliberate choices buried in mechanics and names and geography than most players will ever think to look for. This is part of what has given the franchise its longevity, the sense that the world it offers is genuinely inexhaustible, that no matter how many times you have played through it, there is something in it that you have not yet noticed. The specific facts that accumulate over years of careful examination speak to a design culture that pays attention to the complete experience, not just the parts that are most visible and most likely to be engaged with. Someone decided that each Spinda would have a statistically unique spot pattern. Someone decided that Nurse Joy's name would carry a medical designation in its language of origin. Someone decided that the Enigma berry would have a question mark painted on its skin. These are not accidental details. They are the result of people asking themselves how to make the world more itself than it strictly needed to be. That quality of building more than is required, of caring about layers that most players will never consciously register, is one of the things that distinguishes the Pokemon games from experiences that are merely functional. A functional game gives you what you need to play it. A game that cares about its own world gives you things to find, things to connect, things to wonder about. Things that make the world feel inhabited by the same kind of intention that inhabits the real world, where everything has a reason, and the reasons are often more interesting than the things they explain. The tradition of placing Game Freak inside the game world connects to something broader about how the franchise thinks about the relationship between players and the people who build what players play. The Pokemon games have always been addressed to players in ways that acknowledge the relationship, from the professor who opens the game and asks your name, to the gym leaders who comment on the battles you share with them, to the rivals whose journeys mirror your own in ways that feel personal rather than incidental. This sense of personal address, of being spoken to as a specific individual rather than a generic user, is part of what has made the franchise feel meaningful to generations of players who started their journeys at different ages and in different circumstances. The game knew your name. The world responded to your presence. The people you met had things to say to you specifically, even if the same words were delivered to everyone who played. The mechanics of personalization in these games are limited. The feeling they create is not. What the franchise has consistently done well is make the mechanical limitations of that personalization feel like richness rather than restriction. The game cannot actually know you. It can only know the name you typed and the choices you made. But within those limits, it behaves as if it knows you, addressing you directly, responding to your actions, placing your name in records and conversations and milestone moments across the entire length of the experience. The feeling of being in relationship with the world, even when that relationship is formally quite simple. is one of the game's most consistent achievements. The sea lion Pokemon that have appeared across the franchise's history, Seal, Dugong, and Poplio, represent three different decades of design practice converging on the same animal inspiration: first generation design, sixth generation design, and the ongoing evolution of how the franchise represents marine life in its creature catalog. Three approaches, three generations, three visual interpretations of a single animal. Looking at the three together reveals how the franchise's visual language and design priorities have shifted over time. First generation designs tend towards simplicity and directness, capturing the essential form of the inspiration with minimal complexity. Sixth generation designs bring more personality and performance to the same biological foundation, adding behavioral qualities and emotional expressiveness that the earlier approach did not emphasize. The translation of Sea Lion through 3 decades of Pokemon design history is a small case study in how the franchise aesthetic has evolved. The fact that these three form a complete and closed set, that no other Sea Lion Pokemon has joined them despite 9 generations of continued design work, suggests that the franchise considers the animal thoroughly explored through the three designs it has produced. Whether a fourth Sea Lion design will eventually appear, or whether the category will remain a small and specific group, is a question that only future generations will answer. For now, the three form a quiet set, united by biology, separated by time, each one reflecting the design philosophy of the era that produced it. That kind of grouping, where creatures share an animal inspiration across multiple generations, creates connections within the Pokemon catalog that reward fans who organize their knowledge of the franchise thematically rather than generationally. The Sea Lion set is small and easy to contain. Other thematic groupings are larger and more complicated, spanning more generations and more design interpretations. But each one creates a thread that runs through the franchise's history, a recurring subject examined from multiple angles across the full span of the series. The many languages that the Pokemon franchise operates across have created a distributed set of differences in how the games are experienced by players in different regions. Most of these differences are minor adjustments made for cultural or phonological appropriateness, transparent to players who encounter only one version. Some, like the Beldum Mitong naming issue in Korean, create genuine divergences that reflect how the same naming logic produces different results in different linguistic contexts. The broader phenomenon of translated Pokemon names diverging from their originals reveals how much cultural and linguistic specificity is embedded in the original Japanese names, and how that specificity is handled differently by different localization teams operating with different priorities. Some localizations prioritize maintaining the wordplay embedded in the Japanese name and build equivalent wordplay in the target language. Others prioritize phonological similarity and lose some of the original meaning. Others prioritize clarity about the creature's inspiration at the expense of the cleverness of the original construction. The result is that players in different language contexts have received slightly different texts of the same game, experiencing the same mechanics and the same creatures, but through names and descriptions that carry different resonances and different kinds of meaning. For players who know only one language version, this variation is invisible. For players who compare versions, it reveals a layer of adaptation work that is both impressive and inevitably imperfect, the translation of a creative system built in one language into multiple others. Names like Nurse Joy, where the translation shifted the meaning in a way that preserved the warmth while changing the specific intent, are examples of how that work proceeds in practice. The spirit is maintained, the letter is changed, and both versions carry their own kind of truth about the character they describe. The Pokemon world is constructed from layers that the games allow you to engage with at different levels of attention. At the surface level, it is a story about a young trainer who travels a region, catches Pokemon, battles gym leaders, and eventually challenges the most powerful trainers in the land. That story is enjoyable and complete at the surface. Most of the people who have played the games have experienced it primarily at that level, moving through the world with enough engagement to enjoy the adventure without examining the architecture beneath it. Below that surface level, there is a world built from specific numbers, specific names, specific design choices, specific mechanical decisions, each one made by someone with a specific reason. Spinda's spot patterns are generated from personality values. Focus energy inverts its effect in Generation 1 because of a coding error. The Twins Trainer class uses random AI because its developers decided that an inexperienced young trainer should behave like a wild Pokémon in battle. These are the levels where the world becomes most interesting to examine, where the gap between what the game says and what the game does reveals something about how it was built. Further below that, there are the connections between things, the patterns that emerge when you hold multiple facts against each other and ask what they have in common. The two dual-typed base starters both share grass typing. The dark type's first specialist gym leader arrived exactly 20 years after the type's introduction. The legendary horses that bond with Calyrex are precisely the two types super effective against the type combination Calyrex itself carries. These patterns feel like discoveries, small mathematical or thematic truths that the game didn't announce, but that emerge when you ask the right questions. The deepest level is the one that connects the game's design to the larger world outside it. The cultural references embedded in move names, the historical knowledge encoded in location designs, the literary traditions invoked by move names drawn from Latin phrases. At this level, the games become part of a much larger conversation, something that has been going on for much longer than the franchise's history, and the designer's participation in that conversation becomes visible in specific, traceable details. The question of what makes a Pokemon memorable is one that every generation of the franchise has answered differently, and the answers have accumulated into a catalog that reflects the changing aesthetics and priorities of the people who built it. Some Pokemon are memorable because of how they look, designs with strong silhouettes and clear visual identities that persist in memory long after a single encounter. Others are memorable because of their mechanical identity, creatures whose battle utility made them constants in competitive play for years. Others are memorable for the specific places they appeared in the games, the routes and dungeons and events that created the context for encounters that stuck. The most enduring Pokemon tend to be memorable for multiple reasons simultaneously. Creatures whose visual identity and mechanical identity and contextual appearance all reinforce each other. Pikachu is memorable because it looks like what it is, because it appeared at the center of the anime story for years, because it represents the franchise in contexts far outside the games themselves. Mewtwo is memorable because its design is striking, because the dungeon where you find it is designed to create a sense of occasion, because the lore surrounding its creation carries genuine emotional weight. These are Pokemon whose memorability is overdetermined, supported from multiple directions at once. The facts that sit quietly behind the memorable surface, the stats and the naming origins and the design references, are part of what builds that overdetermination. Knowing that Mewtwo's presence near Ditto is not an accident, but a deliberate reflection of their shared origin, adds a layer to an already layered creature. Knowing that Lucario's signature move was named to reference Street Fighter adds a layer to a Pokemon that is already richly designed. The additional layers don't replace the surface, they deepen it, making the memorable thing more worth remembering. The Pokemon games have always been organized around the concept of discovery, and the specific facts that fill their hidden layers are consistent with that organizing concept. Discovery is what happens when you encounter something you did not expect, when a question you thought had a simple answer turns out to have a more interesting one, when a detail you passed over reveals itself as meaningful on closer examination. The games are built to support that kind of discovery at multiple levels, from the discovery of a new Pokemon in an unexpected location to the discovery that a specific move has a specific name that references a specific piece of cultural history that you hadn't thought to connect to Pokemon before. The experience of discovering these facts is part of the ongoing relationship between the franchise and the community that has grown up around it. Players who found Spinda in the tall grass and wondered about the spots eventually found the mathematical explanation. Players who used focus energy and felt their critical hits weren't improving eventually found the coding error. Players who named their rival without thinking about what the game might suggest eventually found the heart and the soul waiting in the blank field. Each of these discoveries was made by someone who was paying close enough attention to notice a gap between what they expected and what they experienced. The gap is where the discovery lives. The franchise is full of gaps, carefully constructed by people who knew that the right kind of gap invites investigation, and that investigation produces the kind of engagement that keeps players coming back long after the main story has been finished and the champion has been defeated and the Pokédex has been filled as completely as any single player's patience can carry it. There is something in the nature of these late hours that suits these kinds of discoveries particularly well. The mind moves differently when the usual pressures of attention are absent, when there is no urgency to arrive at a conclusion or act on an insight, when the information can simply settle and find its own place in the landscape of things you know. These are the hours for noticing connections, for letting the specific details of a franchise you have loved speak to you at a pace that the busier parts of the day don't permit. The Pokémon that carried unique names in different languages, the hidden lore in heart-scale locations, the deliberately inverted coding of a first-generation move, these facts are not urgent. They don't need to be acted on. They are simply interesting, genuinely and quietly interesting in the way that small, precise truths are interesting when encountered without the pressure to immediately convert them into something useful. They are the franchise saying, look how carefully this was made, not to impress anyone in particular, but because making something carefully was the practice. And the practice left traces everywhere. Those traces are worth following, not because they change anything about the games, which were already complete long before most players found these details, but because they change the texture of how the games feel when you return to them, or think about them, or let them surface in the quieter moments of the day when the mind has room for something like this. The franchise is richer for the traces it left. The experience is richer for the players who followed them. The full catalog of the franchise across its 9 generations represents an extraordinary accumulation of deliberate choices, each one made by someone with a specific intention, each one leaving a trace in the game that persists as long as the games themselves persist. The persistence of these traces is one of the more remarkable features of the medium. Books can be lost, buildings can be demolished, oral traditions can break, but digital games, preserved across copies and emulations and physical cartridges maintained by people who understood their historical value, carry their traces indefinitely. The focus energy bug in Generation 1 has existed in the code for over 25 years and will continue to exist for as long as the game exists. The palindrome in Girafarig's name has been there since 1999 and will be readable for as long as the franchise continues. The question mark on the Enigma Berry's artwork persists in every copy of every game that contains it. These are small and specific things, but their persistence across decades gives them a quality that most details in most media don't accumulate, a durability that comes simply from the medium and the care of the community that preserves it. This durability means that the facts discovered today about the Generation 1 or Generation 2 games are being discovered with the same accuracy as the facts discovered the year those games were released. The game has not changed. The code has not drifted. The numbers are the same numbers they were, and the discoveries made by new players encountering these games for the first time today are the same discoveries that experienced players made decades ago. The same gaps between expectation and reality, the same quiet surprises waiting in the same places. The franchise's commitment to building more than is strictly necessary. To filling its world with details that exceed what the game requires to function is ultimately a statement about what kind of thing the franchise believes it is making. A game that cares only about function does not put a question mark on a berry that most players will never examine closely. It does not construct a palindrome into a Pokemon's name and then follow it 20 years later with an anagram. It does not encode the Japanese medical designation for female doctor into the name of a character whose role most players understand without knowing the name's origin. These choices say something about the relationship between the people who make these games and the people who play them. They say, "We believe you are worth the extra attention. We believe that the details you never consciously register still shape your experience of the world. We believe that building something carefully is its own justification, independent of whether the care is visible or acknowledged. We believe that the world we are building deserves to be built well, because the people who will spend time in it deserve a world built with full attention." That belief, expressed in thousands of specific choices across 30 years of games, is part of what the Pokemon franchise is. Not just the surface story, not just the catching and battling and exploring, but the complete commitment to making the world real enough that its hidden details are worth discovering. The franchise has always been, underneath everything, an act of serious attention paid to something that brings people joy. And the traces of that attention are everywhere in it, waiting for whoever is paying close enough attention to find them. These facts have been sitting in the games for years, and the games will continue to hold them for as long as anyone is playing or preserving them. New players will find them for the first time. Old players will be reminded of them and connect them to things they have known separately for years. Researchers will document them. Fan communities will discuss and debate and extend them in directions the original designers could not have anticipated. The facts are alive in that way, part of an ongoing conversation between the game and everyone who has ever spent time in it. And as this particular quiet conversation drifts toward its own conclusion, the things worth carrying away from it are not the individual facts themselves, but the quality of attention they point toward. Pay attention to the things you might overlook. Ask why things are named what they are. Notice when a creature appears in a location where it shouldn't be unless something connects it to something else. Check whether a move does what it says it does. Look at the item artwork carefully. These are not just things to do in a Pokemon game, they are a practice for how to move through any carefully made world. The world of Pokemon was made with care, and the care is visible if you look for it. It has been there all along, in every generation, in every region, in every fact that rewards the attention of someone who slowed down long enough to notice it. It remains there now, patient and persistent, exactly where it was when it was placed, waiting for whoever comes to find it next. There are places in every game where something almost made it through, and there are places in every game where something more than seemed necessary was built in anyway, where the care exceeded the requirement and left a trace that persisted long after anyone expected it to be noticed. The Pokemon franchise is full of those places, and the quieter the hour, the more clearly you can sometimes hear what they have been saying all along. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.